but they had not been broken in, and her new shoes offered more cushioning than her old ones, but they had not been broken in, and she was not used to walking such distances. After a couple of hours, her calves were sore. Seeing her difficulties, he called a halt, and they rested. He gave her water and something that looked like large crackers, but tougher. The sun barely penetrated the forest, for many of the trees here were still green. These, Eggleston pointed out, had needles instead of leaves, with their seeds in cones. Such trees did well up in the cold north, and they would stay green year-round. The other trees, those with leaves in an array of fall colors, he identified for her: the birch, with its white bark and yellow leaves; the orange-decked maple; the reddish-brown oak; and the fire-cherry tree, whose leaves changed from deep green to purple. To Phoebe, who had never left the concrete world of many apples, all this was new. A few trees had managed to survive in the city's squalor, but never had she seen so many together. She confessed that she had never given them much thought. "A tree is very much like a man," Eggleston observed. "It breathes like us, it has veins like us, and a kind of skin. These trees grow from a tiny seed, as we do. See the tiny sapling over there. You would never guess that one day it will become a mighty oak. In the same way, if you had never seen a baby before, all weak and helpless, you would never guess that he would grow to be a man, strong and proud. The trees also look after their little ones, in a way. The older ones provide shade so that the young can survive the summer drought, and in the winter, their bulk helps to block the cold wind. Unlike us, the trees' roots go deep, hidden from view like our own, but still there, the place from which we come, the long line stretching back into our past." She pondered this idea, which was still jarring to her, that the past could be a source of strength, not shame. It went against everything she had been taught, everything that the retribution had insisted upon as the price of her continued existence. Yet the idea resonated deep within her, at that point of contact where her carefully learned guilt scraped against her affection for her grandparents. She had never been willing to resolve that conflict by consigning them into the evil times, but what about the generation before? At what point in the past did goodness become evil? And how could that evil be transmitted down through the generations, even to, and through, the ones she loved? In Eggleston's words, she sensed a radically different view of the past, but its precise nature still eluded her. They resumed their trek as the sun lowered behind them, the play of light and shadow slowly yielding to darkness. Listening to birdsong and the rustle of leaves took her mind off the soreness in her legs. They made 2 more stops, but the pain of restarting their hike made her want to press on until they were done for the day. As the sun set, Eggleston identified the place where they would be staying for the night, a clearing not far from a small lake. Once her pack was off, her back and shoulders ached even more, and her heels felt raw. Yet the excitement of spending the night far from her old world made every pain bearable. After all, the last time darkness fell, the city had nearly consumed her. Eggleston went about gathering wood, the white bark she now recognized as birch, along with brush and sticks of various sizes. She watched in wonder as he made a fire. Using a knife and a stone from his pack, after several tries he succeeded in producing a tiny wisp of smoke that curled up from the pile. He bent down and blew on it, added some brush to the sparks, and soon a reassuring blaze was crackling. As she sat by the fire, fascinated by its magical flicker, he gathered larger pieces of wood and built up a sizable pile nearby. Next, he pulled a pan from his pack, along with other items, and Phoebe watched with increasing interest as he began to cook them a meal. Dried bacon, beans, and dried slices he identified as potatoes were transformed into the most delicious food she had ever tasted. Afterwards, they watched the fire in silence. Occasionally she would steal a glance at him across the fire, as the shadows played across his face. Then he looked up, and their eyes met. Quickly she returned her gaze to the fire and nervously cleared her throat. "It's hard to believe this is really happening. I wish my mother could be here. She would never have imagined it was possible." Minds. Even as she was telling it, she came to realize that this was the true history. It wasn't the chronicle in which millions of people receded into anonymity, but it was the story she would want to live on after her. With her own death, all this would vanish forever, as if these people had never been. He listened to her with understanding and sympathy. But when she spoke of her father, she began to cry, and he moved next to her so that she could lean against him. With his arm about her, she felt secure, just as she had with her father so long ago, and it was easier to go on. When she had finished, there was silence for a long while. Then she asked, "What about your parents?" He was looking into the fire, and she saw something dark flash across his eyes. "I'll have to save that for another time. It's getting late." He slowly released his arm and got up. He was right, of course, and maybe it was unreasonable to hope that he would begin to tell her his story when she had already talked for so long. But it was more than that. He was holding back. Perhaps, she thought, he isn't comfortable enough to speak of such things yet. It was all right. She could wait. Besides, late or not, the physical and emotional exhaustion of the last 24 hours was catching up with her, and her eyelids were becoming impossibly heavy. After putting some more wood on the fire, Edelston went over to his pack, brought back the sleeping bag, and unrolled it for her. "Here you go, this should be enough for tonight. But where will you sleep?" "I'll be here, close by. But it's cold." He grinned. "I'll be okay." So she settled in, her back grateful for the rest. As she looked up at the starry sky bordered by treetops, it was hard to believe that the same sky shone over many apples, where she had been only one night ago. Other thoughts flitted through her mind, wild speculations as to where Edelston might be taking her. But soon she yielded to her weary body's demand for sleep. When Phoebe woke up, her body ached, but the last thing she wanted to do was get out of the sleeping bag. A weak, grayish light announced day's arrival, but when she looked to where Edelston had slept, she saw with a panic that he was gone. She turned around only to find him sitting a few feet behind her, a flat stone in one hand, a knife in the other. As he began to scrape the knife on the stone, she saw that it had a curious shape, a long blade that rounded up at the end, with a top that slanted downward to meet the sharp point. When he held it up to examine its edge, she noticed that the handle appeared to be some kind of bone, and along it ran dozens of cuts, perhaps to make it easier to grip. Looking over at her, he smiled. "I thought I'd let you sleep in. We have a long day ahead of us." While he heated breakfast over the embers of the fire, she went down to the lake to wash off. The water was cool and bracing. When she returned, Edelston examined her feet for blisters. Today's hike, he warned, would be the hardest on her muscles and joints, but after that, she would find it easier as her body began to adapt. He took out a waxy substance and rubbed it on her feet. After this, he put her socks on, then her shoes, cinching them up tightly. The day turned out as he said it would, but the stunning beauty of the forest in fall helped distract her from the aches in her limbs. Not since childhood had she felt so alive, with a child's sense of wonder about the world. All about them, nature was preparing for the winter, and Ethelstan showed her the signs. The squirrels scurrying about were hiding nuts, stockpiling food. She saw deer for the first time, graceful dozen stags with majestic antlers, venturing boldly out of the deep forest to find food they could pack into their bodies to last them through the hard months. Everywhere, the animals showed a determination to survive that made her ashamed of her own earlier despair. More than once, a flock of birds flew across their path, flying in the shape of a V. Geese, he called them, and they were flying south to avoid the harsh winter. Smart creatures, he commented. Themselves. Yet nature now looked to her own defense, discouraging those seeking after the resources of the area. Beasts once seldom seen now multiplied in great numbers. The black bear, the wolf, the elk, the lynx, and the cougar. Even the mighty grizzly bear, moving steadily east for decades, had made his way back into the great north woods of Wisconsin and Michigan. There was yet another force, however, that menaced anyone who ventured into these forests, the solitary residents known as werewolves. Some whites, he said, had taken to the wilderness during the hunger, a few even earlier than that, during the darkening. In areas increasingly depopulated, they tried to survive by hunting and fishing. Many of them perished, unable to endure the long winters, and not just individuals but entire families. But some still lingered, mostly old men now, our fathers and sons, and they shot on sight any who ventured too near. Men going their own way, he called them, without higher purpose or posterity. Their hold on the imagination was so strong that even in the city Phoebe had heard rumors of the werewolves without really knowing what they were. But I think even a god would live in a community. 7. Ethelstan, she came to see, had not only traveled widely, but read widely, an even rarer accomplishment. She asked where he had come across such ideas. I don't just scavenge people. When I am in the outlands, I scavenge books, too. In both cases, I've learned, not all are worth saving. The retribution happened for a reason, or rather millions of reasons, some of them with faces, and some of them with pages. Such enigmatic remarks were common with Ethelstan. As they resumed their journey, she noticed that despite the heaviness of his pack, Ethelstan moved with a remarkable lightness of foot. At times, he would scout up ahead. At others, he would fall back, directing her to continue on, only to catch up with her a short time later. Occasionally he stopped to examine a plant, and he might gather some of its leaves for a purpose unknown to her. More rarely, it was to examine one of the sites, which he called caches, where he had previously placed supplies along their route. But when he didn't have her to pace him, he moved rapidly, stepping deftly on rock or log but never seeming to put his full weight down, carried forward by his own momentum, almost gliding. How fast could he make this trek without me, and without a heavy pack? She wondered. Clenching her teeth through the soreness, she managed to continue on until twilight, when Ethelstan called a halt at a suitable place to camp. This time, she helped him find wood for the fire. Afterwards, as he prepared dinner, she asked him questions about it, for it was such a strange thing to make one's own food, but out here a necessary skill. Once their hunger was sated, Ethelstan said he should examine her feet. She tenderly took off her shoes, whereupon he placed her feet up on his lap. The blisters on her heels had torn, leaving the skin raw. He cut away the dirty skin, put an ointment over the rawness, then wrapped it with a bandage. The rest of her feet were sore, but not as bad. I'm sorry, she confessed, I'm probably not as tough as some of the other people you've rescued. No, you're doing just fine, he said, adding cryptically, there have been much worse times. He began to rub her feet, which after the day's long walk was pure ecstasy to Phoebe. It felt like such an intimate act, yet given their situation, it was sensible enough that she was able to overcome her natural shyness. All she really wanted was for him to keep doing this, but the silence made it awkward. Her textbooks. At her prompting, he explained that Ann Arbor had been the name of a city in Michigan. Prior to the Retribution, every state could boast at least one large university whose mission was to hasten the destruction of anything that might hold society together. Ann Arbor was home to such a school, and over the decades, it faithfully led the youth down a path to racial ruin on every issue that had once seemed so important to whites: the legalization of abortion, and later, of marijuana, affirmative action, a kind of early attempt at the darkening, he said, open immigration, homosexuality, and transgenderism. This last term Edelston had to explain, for while Phoebe knew of a few gay men, the phenomenon of people refusing to be their biological sex was one that the Retribution had little patience for. Such luxuries had evidently disappeared alongside many others once known to white society. Presiding over this haven of enlightenment, he told her, was the university faculty, who administered a solid education in white guilt and the glories of diversity. Like John the Baptist, Phoebe thought, only making the way straight for the Retribution. Yet when the long-awaited utopia finally arrived, it proved to be other than as advertised. Under the darkening, every year brought more firings of white professors. The administration even closed down the Department of Women's Studies in order to expand the Center for Islamic Law. While Phoebe was all too familiar with Sharia, she was at a loss regarding women's studies. Edelston explained that such a school, in fact, taught none of the female arts and skills, but employed self-hating, childless women intent on turning out others like themselves. While Phoebe had no idea of what the female skills and arts might be, she decided to let that question wait. By now, the city's Muslim population had grown considerably, aided by decades of uncontrolled immigration. Matters came to a head in 2055, at the dedication of a new mosque. At this halfway point in the darkening, the city's progressive elite, the Gran Oligarchy, he dubbed it, had, with much fanfare, footed the bill for a huge mosque, located on the site of the old university golf course. In this way, they hoped to collectively atone for the wrongs that their white ancestors had done to Muslims. Emboldened by their newfound power, Muslims came from across the country for the founding, which was also attended by the university and all the flamboyant sexual identities it was capable of producing. At some point during the festivities, a flashpoint was reached as the more hidebound guests of the hour took offense at something they had seen or heard, some incident now lost to memory. The assembled Muslim crowds rioted, and in 3 days of carnage, the city experienced all the horrors that attended Constantinople's fall. The homosexuals and childless progressives, who had so eagerly rejected their ancestors, were raped and butchered. Within a generation, the city was entirely Muslim, and Bar, a stronghold to match its neighbor, born. The only hint of the city's past was the occasional glimpse of white skin or blue eyes under the burqa, worn by the female survivors of a Holocaust, made to bear children at last. The historical references he made were unfamiliar to her, coming as they did neither from the Bible nor her textbooks. But the theme was familiar enough, a race apparently bent on its own destruction. My grandparents, Edelston added, fled south with my father, who was a child then. That's how they ended up in Indiana, where he later met my mother. He lapsed into silence, lost in thought. Did you know your grandfather well? Not really. We didn't get along. Was he mean? Edelston paused. Well, he could be cranky enough, but that wasn't what bothered me. As I got older, I realized how he was locked in the pre-ret mindset. He acted as if this were still the progressive days of the 20s and 30s. I know he was old, he had to have been around 40 at the time of the retribution. But there was more to it than that. I mean, he had seen the sack of Ann Arbor, and even after that, he didn't question the way things were going. In his mind, the darkening was justified, because the historical injustices were so great, that only drastic measures could set them right. Deep. But it bothered me that people could just accuse you of things that you had no part in, events you'd never even heard of, much less been alive for. Where was America when the Crusades took place? Where was I? In her mind's eye, Phoebe saw the word retribution as it had appeared on the cover of her textbooks, spelled out in chains, with a loose handcuff hanging off the end of the final letter. It was meant to remind the student, in a sort of visual shortcut, of the textbook's constantly repeated lesson. This is why the retribution was necessary, a just punishment for past wrongs. History's vengeance. Only now, she was starting to see how the chains of that retribution were not, in fact, ancient shackles burst asunder, but more recent ones, gradually enclosing around the minds of whites everywhere. How long had that process been going on? He told her then about a religious group from 2 centuries BTR, the Shakers. They believed that it was sinful for men and women to mate, or even to have physical contact. So they kept the 2 genders separate, and they replenished their numbers by adopting orphans and indoctrinating them into their Shaker beliefs. When he first came across them in a book, he had realized that the progressive intellectuals were the Shakers of the latter days, before the retribution. They replenished their numbers not so much by having children as by brainwashing the children of others through their control of education. It was they who were the proper authors of the retribution, and it was they who became its first victims. Together they watched the fire in silence. At some point, she must have drifted off to sleep, for she awoke to find Edelston carrying her to the sleeping bag. Only a tired murmur escaped her lips before she sank back into slumber. Phoebe awoke in the middle of the night to the sound of rustling. In the darkness around them, something was stepping on the dried leaves. She sat up, but there was only silence, and Edelston sleeping beside her. Yet she was sure she had heard it. Lying back down, she waited for the sound again, but it never came. Her fearful vigil could have been 5 minutes, or it could have been an hour, so disorienting was the forest at night, but sleep finally came. Asterisk 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 she was lying on her side when she awoke, hearing the birds chatter as the light broke through the branches. Edelston stood about 10 meters away, leaning over a creek as he washed himself. It was the first time she had seen him shirtless. As he rose, she studied his body from the safe vantage of pretended sleep. His muscles were not bulging, but their outline was clear to see. There was a leanness to him, a threatening tightness, like a tightly wound coil. As he turned about, drying himself off, she saw several scars that streaked across his body. One ran down his ribs on the left side, long and thin. Another, short but cruel, lay near his right shoulder blade. A third streaked across the outside of his left thigh. These, along with smaller marks and the scar across his forehead, suggested a man steeped in violence, one who did not run from it but returned as if to feed. As he finished drying and walked toward her, she realized how little she knew about this man. Seeing her lying there, he smiled, and she pretended to wake up. That day, she discovered that she could keep a faster pace than before. The same aches and pains clamored for attention, but she had learned to keep them at a mental distance. A few hours into their hike, they came to the remains of Highway 63 stretching away north and south. Unused for decades, the road was slowly being submerged by nature, which had eaten away at the highway's edges and broken through from beneath. Phoebe was amazed to see concrete and asphalt conquered by soft grass and flowers. Only now, on the 3rd day, did she begin to appreciate the vast distances involved in their journey. Their relationship with the space around them had changed. In the city, a block traveled on foot was not the same as a block traveled by bus, and that difference became even more pronounced once they had left the city behind. In his car, her mind had whirled as they covered 100 kilometers in less than an hour. Distance became laughable, immaterial. But though they conquered distance, it was a victory they did not earn. Once they were on foot, it reasserted its hegemony, and with it came a more mentally manageable pace. If you were walking in an open field, one which ended up ahead at the edge of the forest, you had time to see the transition coming, to think about it, observe it, and feel it in your body as light and temperature and sound shifted. In the car, you felt nothing. A forest that might have taken an hour's walk whipped by and was gone before you had a chance to notice anything. There. To the north is the sea, of course, and to the east. Seconds slipped by, and he showed no sign of finishing the sentence. Yes, to the east, it's all wilderness until you get to the Troll Bridge, and that I will not be crossing. Troll Bridge. He stopped walking. It's the great span that divides the southern sea from the eastern sea. Up. That evening, after they found a suitable place and settled down for the night, she sat down by the fire next to Athelstan, not across from him. She knew he was by nature inclined toward silence and reflection, but she wanted to hear more. He knew of events far beyond her tiny world of many apples. And these things he knew from experience, or from those who had experienced them, not from retribution and the Rainbow Nation. She wanted to hear more, and not only because she suspected that he held the key to the mystery of her world, of how a once mighty race had fallen. Above all, she wanted to hear more because it was Athelstan talking. Father. Contact with the outside world was not as regular as it had once been. As he began his story, Phoebe did not understand all the words, but she knew each question would only lead to another story spinning off from this one. She first wanted to hear the full sweep of his narrative. Once, he told her, America had regarded itself as the center of the world, the exceptional nation as they had called it. Only a century and a half ago, America had more factories than the rest of the planet combined. It was the wealthiest country in history. But as with Rome, a name Phoebe recognized from the primeval era, the empire's prosperity had led its citizens to assume it would never end. In both cases, the root stock of the empire came to believe that they could take in people from all over the world, without end, that to be a Roman or an American was simply a state of mind. In Rome, the citizenship that had once been the envy of the ancient world became cheap, automatic. Such was also the case with America, for America became simply an idea in one's head, and ideas know no barriers of blood. While the national mythologies of Rome and America both acknowledge that their unique set of institutions had been founded by a particular people, surely that only created a duty for them to be the model for others and, if need be, their liberator. They convinced themselves that, like a gospel message, their identity was something that could be shared without being diminished, or that it even became stronger by being spread. Americans fooled themselves into believing that the country could absorb any culture, any religion, and only be the better for it. In the end, all that this motley band of races held in common was not religion, or history, or even language, but solely their identity as consumers. They were not a nation, but merely people who happened to live on the same plot of earth for the purpose of making money off each other. And what of the whites themselves? They became hollowed out, empty inside, because to emphasize their own identity, something that could not be acquired by merely raising a hand and signing a piece of paper, would contradict this powerful myth. From reading her book, he said, he could see that she understood that whites had brought the retribution upon themselves. They allowed their children to be taught white guilt, although those children were increasingly rare, for why bring guilty beings into the world? They alone, of all the world's races, were happily complicit in their own replacement. But if America's collapse had many causes, it had just as many results. As a result of the darkening, open borders, and the displacement of the white population, the government had no more money for foreign adventures, and the legions were called home. The money had simply dried up. International communications had declined steadily over the 3 generations since the retribution began. During the darkening, the military and private companies had reserved the last 5% of their white workforce for the most technical fields, such as engineering and satellite operations, areas overwhelmingly dominated by whites. But when the final year came, that meant the required swap in workforce in those fields was near total, and there were simply not enough qualified engineers to replace them. In disgust, the last satellite operators simply walked off the job, and the ground stations were abandoned, then plundered. Far above them in the night sky, he assured her, there were satellites endlessly circling the Earth, sheep with no shepherd to guide them. Their silence meant an end to navigational guidance for airplanes and ships. It crippled the power grids and computer systems that depended on satellites to synchronize their timing. The pathetic remains of America's economic and military might collapsed as the retribution ran its course. Planes and ships would still arrive from abroad, but nothing like the days when New York City was the financial capital of the world. China initially benefited from the retribution. For decades prior, it had been steadily buying up land and factories in America, and the turmoil of the darkening and the hunger allowed it to buy up entire towns whose populations were streaming out. Chinese businesses moved production to America and Canada, where products could be made cheaply nearer the market, but this disrupted the economy back in the homeland, where popular outrage erupted. The Chinese government's authority bent in some areas, fractured in others, then finally collapsed altogether. As had happened so many times in the country's history, the distant provinces seceded, and warlords fought over the remainder. Reports of bloodshed on an almost unimaginable scale occasionally made their way across the oceans. Tens of millions of refugees flooded into Korea and Japan, where the native populations had long since stopped having children, creating an existential crisis for the gray-haired natives there. Events in China had stranded the plant managers and factory farm supervisors in North America. They simply took over ownership and ran their facilities with a completely free hand. Like the Sharia zones in Hispanic cities, they recognized no higher outside authority. They were now reaching into the abandoned towns, with ambitious plans to clear out the werewolves and rebuild. But already, Eggleston told her, there were signs that much of the popular animosity toward whites was finding a new target in the more prosperous Asian groups. It was an open question whether the Chinese would succeed in establishing themselves as the new elite. True, they did not feel one speck of guilt for being Chinese, which was more than could be said for whites. But technology had plateaued in the past century, for the Asians showed no signs of the whites' genius for invention. They were clever at copying, but now there was no one to copy from. As for Japan, it had initially managed to maintain some of the high technology of the early 21st century, but the tidal wave of refugees from the continent plunged it into a catastrophe, aggravated by great earthquakes and typhoons. The cataclysm seemed to awaken something of a survival mechanism, a stirring in the blood. A popular movement to destroy modern technology gained momentum. Sword-wielding fanatics cut the throats of the engineers and time and motion experts, and the factories were blown up. Eggleston had heard rumors that in Japan, old ways had returned, traditions that had guided them for hundreds of years before American gunships forced their way in. All was shrouded in mystery, however, for few outsiders ever returned alive from that land. By mid-century, few nations could afford oil transported from the Middle East. In America, the darkening had taken the oil fields and refineries from whites only to hand it to Arabs who had positioned themselves for this windfall. For a century, they complained, America had fomented war in the Middle East to keep the oil-producing nations divided, and the Arabs had suffered most of all. True retribution dictated that America's oil go to Arab hands. They now presided over virtual city-states in the oil fields and offshore sites, pressing the desperate Hispanics into labor for them. But the disappearance of buyers for Middle Eastern oil led to a total collapse of that region's economies. Religious and ethnic civil war reduced the region to Stone Age conditions, but not before the Muslim millions, in need of a scapegoat, massacred every Jew they could find. Israel put up a stout defense, but in the end, the only survivors were those able to escape by ship or plane. Rumor held that they had landed on islands off the coast of Africa, where they killed on sight any unwanted arrivals as a matter of survival. Long before the tribute money paid for Middle Eastern oil halted, the flow of billions of dollars from America in the form of foreign aid and charity had dried up, as America itself joined the Third World. Without Western relief agencies and a cash influx, Africa's economies imploded. Its population had been climbing dramatically for over a century, surpassing even that of Asia. Those billions now erupted in ethnic conflict, as a series of genocidal wars replaced the modern borders with tribal ones. Those who could escape to Europe and America did so, hijacking merchant vessels and forcing their crews to take them to lands whose emergent squalor looked heavenly in comparison with the horrors they had left behind. This piracy, however, discouraged any more ships from arriving on that continent. As for India and Pakistan, in the first half of the century they had engaged in a brief but devastating nuclear war that left large swaths of both countries uninhabitable. As the Western world turned inward, the subcontinent succumbed to mass starvation. No word had been heard from Australia and New Zealand in many years. Asian immigration had overtaken the white population by mid-century. There, too, whites had subjected themselves to a form of the retribution, atoning for the crimes of their ancestors. Closer to home, on the other side of the Northern Sea, the whites of Canada had attempted to redress their sins by signing over vast tracts of their country to the Red Indians. Their misguided charity was foiled as Asians, who felt not a shred of guilt for any mistreatment the Indians had received, took over the great cities of Toronto and Vancouver, while Arabs established their own urban strongholds, as they did in America and Europe. The fragile unity of such a vast, sparsely populated country was further undermined by the collapse of communication. Reigned. Right up to the end, the liberal conscience of Europe continued to beat its chest in repentance for sins real and imagined. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. The continent's whites swore off children in order to save the planet, only to have their lands invaded by races more concerned with progeny than pollution. Most of Europe was no longer European in any meaningful sense. Britain had been democratically transformed into a Muslim caliphate with scarcely a shot being fired. Rome had been overrun, its pope murdered in a reprise of Montezuma's fall, the toppled monarch urging his people to embrace the conquerors. On this continent where the once proud races of Celts and Germans had fought Rome to the death for their freedom, their descendants willingly put the yoke on themselves in hopes they would merely be allowed to live. This act of surrender, dubbed the Atonement, proved the bitter harvest of teaching their children the inescapable shame of being white. Phoebe's mind reeled at the thought of the European continent being overrun. The fate of America, in comparison, seemed less shocking. After all, this country was newer, younger, and thus it had been easy to claim that it was a nation of immigrants, as if the mere fact of moving from one place to another somehow made all the peoples of the world identical, interchangeable, reducible to a blank canvas on which the most absurd fantasies could be rendered. Europe, however, had been the ancient homeland of whites. No matter where the races of the world wandered, Africans still had Africa, the Chinese had China, the Hispanics had most of two continents. But in flooding into Europe, the peoples of Africa and the Middle East had eradicated the homeland of one of the world's races. When the whites were gone, no amount of mixing would ever produce that race, or those nations, again. Such a prospect in America had been eagerly anticipated by the Retribution, and even by some whites themselves before the Retribution. But the fate of Europe seemed tragic beyond words. In all the textbook condemnations of its history she had read, the one thing that struck her is that these peoples clearly had an identity. They knew who they were, and a Frenchman was self-evidently not the same as a Greek or a Swede. No amount of hand-raising or paper signing could transform a foreigner into one. How sad, then, to have an identity, to have one's own language and customs and history that no one else could lay a claim to, and then to lose it not through a valiant war but through telling one's children that it wasn't important. She looked up from the fire to Ethelstan, sitting at her side. "I'm shocked that there wasn't even a fight." He smiled grimly. "Was it any different here? Generations of whites had been taught as you were, that their race was responsible for ruining the world. Decades before the Retribution, white children whose ancestors hadn't even been in this country at the time of the Civil War were made to write poems about what it was like to be a slave. Year after year, from earliest childhood, they were given to understand that there was something uniquely wrong about their race. So what happened when they grew up? Long before the Retribution, whites were led along like sheep, kept in line by the barking of racist or bigot. They would recoil at those words, and rush to deny it, stammering pathetically, hanging their heads in shame. Once you have stringed the instrument thus, you may play any tune you wish upon it. It's not an easy matter to break through years of conditioning. But even when you have, to say something about it, to take a stand when it might cost you your job and plunge your family into poverty, few were prepared to do that. Those, here and there, who tried to fight it were labeled terrorists, and the vast majority of people will accept anything rather than be called a terrorist. She knew he was right. Generations had been so trained to cower at the charge of racism that it had become a kind of short-circuiting of the brain, an instinct strong enough to override even self-preservation. I know, because this is how my parents thought, and how they conditioned me. If a Muslim immigrant committed a terrorist attack, why that just means we need to bring more Muslims into this country, because it's a religion of peace, after all, and we can't let a few fanatics make us succumb to bigotry. But if a white person should carry out an attack on Muslim immigrants, well, that, too, means we need to let in more Muslims, to show how open and tolerant we are. No matter how violent the friction, the only reaction was to increase it still further. 1,000 examples of that friction, the petty as well as the monstrous, played out in Phoebe's head, the daily experience of life in many apples. Tomorrow. Girl. She was asking her mother where her daddy was. "He's in the garth," her mother replied. For the rest of the dream, she followed her mother around, asking her what the garth was, but with no success. She awoke to find it still night, the dying fire casting a weak light. She was on her side, with Ethelstan behind her. Sleep was about to return when, with a shock, she noticed a pair of eyes staring at them from across the fire. Too scared to move and wake up Ethelstan, she watched in terror as the eyes resolved into a face, the face of a cat, only one much taller than any normal cat would be. The beast was huge, with brown fur, a white muzzle, and yellow-green eyes that watched her. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Her terror, kept keen for so long, became a trance, until she could see the eyes even when she blinked, phosphorescent orbs boring into her. At last, she slipped into unconsciousness. Ethelstan woke her early in the morning. When she described the strange animal she'd seen the night before, he became concerned. "Dreaming?" he asked, then answered himself, "But then how would you have been able to describe an animal you've never seen?" There had been something dreamlike about the encounter. She'd been so tired, that the line between dreams and the waking world had become very thin. Perhaps it had vanished altogether. Yet Ethelstan was right. How likely was it that her imagination had conjured up a beast that, unbeknownst to her, actually did roam these woods? Other, more mundane matters soon occupied them as they began the fourth day of their journey. It was grayer today, but the crisp air was invigorating. The hills and valleys around them, covered in rich yellows and reds and oranges and greens, were beautiful beyond anything she had ever seen. She was surprised at how quickly she had gotten used to the daily rhythm, the required actions now becoming habits. The forest seemed completely natural to her. It held its share of dangers, but so did many apples. The key difference, she thought, lay not so much in the nature of the threat but in how she felt in facing it. The city was filled with teeming masses of people indifferent to each other, living amid impersonal, ugly structures that seemed to have been designed to convince the individual yet further of his own insignificance. But no one can survive long if he truly regards himself as insignificant, she reflected, so we survive by regarding others as expendable and worthless. We brutalize each other, yet when we are brutalized, we rage at its injustice. The forest, on the other hand, induced a different kind of awe, a different sense of one's smallness. Death could certainly come here, with none to lament your passing or even know of it. But the forest also encouraged the means to overcome its perils, through self-reliance and industriousness. The city wants you to die, but first it wants you to know you are inconsequential. The forest holds death in one hand, but with the other it bids you become stronger, quicker, sharper. Late in the morning they stopped to rest, but Ethelstan, rather than scout around as he usually did, remained nearby. While she sipped water, she watched him idly dig at the ground with the tip of his shoe, looking up now and then, a faraway look in his eye. Ethelstan, he blinked out of his reverie. Millions. The nations there had been on the receiving end of invasion for centuries, and they had never possessed a colonial empire, so they simply refused to buy into the idea that they were guilty of anything. The atonement found little traction there. As the European lands to the south and west were overrun by young Muslim men intent on finding white women to bear their children, an enclave of ethnic resistance held out. The Great Redoubt, he'd heard it called. Its front line ran along the Danube River from the Black Sea to the borders of Austria, where the Hungarians and Romanians just barely held out, reinforced now and then by Poles, Ukrainians, and other Slavic peoples. For the migrant waves of the early 21st century had given way to organized armies of Turks, Arabs, and North Africans, sweeping across the Balkan Peninsula in the name of this or that caliph. He paused again, nodding almost imperceptibly, as if coming to a decision, then unshuttered his backpack. From it, he pulled a leather-bound volume. Leonidas, my adoptive father, wrote this. The later parts he completed when he was dying. He was a scavenger, like me. It's a kind of journal, and it may help you to understand. Like you and I, he was not Garth-born. For him, the journey began in Europe. He handed it to her. I think this will help answer some of your questions. Phoebe ran her hands over the worn cover of the book, which looked ancient. She didn't need to be told to handle it carefully. Apart from the Retribution's textbooks, it was only the fourth book she had ever held. The words. As much as she wanted to know everything there was to know about Ethelstan, for now she would have to settle for a sort of proxy, in the form of his adoptive father. Perhaps reading the words of the man who became his father would shed some light. But she also expected to find in the adoptive father a kindred spirit to the son, another set of riddles in human form. Phoebe. Landscape. He noticed how the twin ranges gradually curve around, so they resemble the front and back sides of a shield. As for the iron, it runs all through those hills. Once in the iron shield, they followed the twin ranges northeast. When they stopped again, she pulled out Leonida's book. Its pages were made of a yellowed, tough sort of paper. Opening it up, she found sketches of animals and plants with handwritten notes in the margins, alongside page after page of maps, with rivers, paths, and waypoints sketched in painstaking detail. This was a book that was meant to be used, a manual of a man's entire knowledge of the world around him. All to help carry out the scavenger's mission, to rescue all that was worth saving. She marveled at the detailed notes. Curiously, those in the earlier sections of the book were written in a foreign language, with dots and dashes above letters. Later, apparently, he had come back and written in the English next to each entry, and further on, the book was written entirely in English. Had he not known English well enough at first? Somehow she thought not. It was as if he intended to bequeath this book to an heir who spoke his tongue, but later realized such a thing would not happen. Toward the back of the book, there were several pages of uninterrupted writing, all in English. These, she realized, skimming over them, were Leonidas' final words to his son, the life story of a man who had traveled halfway across the earth. Tomorrow, she would take another look at this section. After they resumed their hike, a light rain began to fall, but little made its way through the thick trees. From time to time they caught sight of a road, what Edelston identified as the remains of Highway 77, not used since the migrations of the Hunger. Twilight came early, hemmed in as they were by the iron shield. Her legs were sore, and she felt that they had covered even more distance today. Soon, however, she smiled with anticipation. I will be with Edelston before the fire. Later, as he prepared the night's fire, she watched him, pretending to examine her fingers but all the while studying him. The hard line of his jaw, his prominent cheekbones, his piercing eyes now and then lit by the flames. What is it he had said? I have my own place, but where I live, no one is alone. At the time, she had interpreted this positively, but now she began to question that. Surely, she thought, someone like him would have a woman in his life. And what would I have to offer in comparison? I am not, Garth born, but birthed by the retribution. Would that make me damaged goods? Doubts such as these threatened to unsettle her, so when they sat down side by side, she asked him to tell her of the Garth, wanting to hear his voice to reassure her. Hugging her knees, she looked into the wavering flames as Edelston prodded the burning logs with a stick. Love. He settled back. I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. The Garths were founded over 50 years ago, toward the end of the first decade of the Retribution. They were just a few dozen families at first, and those individuals who joined them, people determined to live apart from a society that was in its death throes. There was great hardship for that first generation, for the founders and their children. It was like beginning society all over again. They had mid-century technology, of course, but it soon became clear that relying on it was only going to make things more difficult in the long run. You see, the Hunger was emptying out all the towns up here, and then there was the fall of. He broke off, and left the rest unspoken. She did not press him, though, knowing that all mysteries cannot be revealed at once. But much harder than physically establishing this community was overcoming the invisible scars left by the Retribution. Even long BTR, whites were forbidden to be proud, and no one put them down more than their own kind. Everyone else on the planet was allowed to be proud of who they were, except whites. In America, the people of color would be called Asian Americans or African Americans or Arab Americans, while we alone were whites. Our children had no heritage, no real traditions worthy of reverence, only this label, white, which was always meant as an insult. It meant someone who had no history, no heritage. A blankness. The founders wanted a future for their children, but they understood that it's not enough to simply not feel guilty. Your heritage, your ancestry, your identity, these can't be a matter of indifference to you. You have to love your heritage, or else you will come to hate who you are. You'll always be trying to fill the void by glomming onto the traditions and creeds of other races. Whites used to make outlandish claims that they had red Indian blood, so desperate were they to have an identity. Or they would seek after Asian religions, as if some other race had discovered the truth for them, and their own ancestors were fools. The fire popped and crackled. Long before they came here, the founders looked for where this love of one's own race might come from. It had to be something so fundamental that it was there from the beginning, something that constitutes our unique identity. Who are we? What distinguishes us from every other race? He held up a hand in front of his face and turned it this way and that. The first, and most obvious answer, is our body. It's funny, but in the decades BTR, it was taught that there is no such thing as race. But the same people also taught that whites were uniquely oppressive and privileged. They wanted it both ways, and logic be damned. Those who made the retribution were at least more honest with themselves. They understood that something must exist, if it is to be condemned. Our unique appearance goes far beyond the color of our skin. Maybe in many apples, you've seen a black who is albino, yet no one would ever confuse him with a white. The structure of our faces, the coloration of our eyes and our hair, the appearance of our bodies, we were forged by ages of ice in Europe, our ancestral homeland. Even as she hung on his words, Phoebe felt a tingling that traveled through her body. She felt as though she were falling, even though she knew she wasn't. It was like a trick her father had once shown her, as he held her arms up while she lay, face down, on the floor. As the blood drained, and with it, sensation, he lowered her arms slowly until it felt as if they were passing through the floor, even though she knew they couldn't be. So it felt now, but with her whole body. Then she began to see with her mind's eye, vividly there in the flames before them, what Ethelstan was describing. The flames faded away, and where they had been, snow lay on the ground. When she turned around, there was no Ethelstan, no sign of their camp at all, and a feeble sun was in the sky. She saw a man trudging through a snowy landscape, dressed in furs. At first, she thought him one of the founders, but then she noticed mountains in the distance that were far larger than the Iron Shield. Oddly, these rose straight up, their white surfaces sheer. Ethelstan's voice sounded inside her, as he said, glaciers, great mountains of moving ice. What had he said before? I guess the best place to start is at the beginning. And without knowing precisely how, she suddenly knew herself to be a wolf, even before she looked down and saw the ashen fur, even before she sniffed the air and understood a language with more words than any that is spoken. Slowly she approached the man, her head bent low, ever closer, until he threw her something, a morsel of food. Then she felt his hand on her, and she did not bite him. Later, when he turned to leave, she followed him back to his village. She stuck by him, keeping watch that night and all the nights that followed, sharing in his food, joining him on the hunt. Days passed, then years, not as though time accelerated, but rather as if, while she was still sitting before the fire, time had dilated around her to allow all this in. In that moment she fit entire lifetimes, entire centuries. She watched the man raise a family, saw the years take their toll on him, until one day she whined softly over his corpse as his family stood round. She went to his son then, and followed him, and his son in turn, and in that third generation watched as the village was struck by disease, when only he and 4 others survived. They left their homes, dwellings hallowed by time, and she traveled with them as companion. In time, they found another clan, and thus it continued, on through the unbroken chain of generations. She witnessed the struggle of life in this forbidding landscape. Men died on the hunt, trying to navigate their way across blank landscapes of snow and ice. Women died in childbirth, and often the infants shortly after. Children full of life died of diseases for which there were no names. but Phoebe, eternal witness, knew to look to the cold, which even in summer could send a chill wind, and to the sun, which in winter failed to rise, ushering in days of darkness. It was a merciless process from which there was no appeal, a relentless hammering into shape, and what shape was slowly becoming clear. As the centuries passed, she found herself recognizing a familiar face, spotting the same beloved trait, a genetic echo down through the generations. This was indeed a race forged in ages of ice. Their skin was pale, taking in every bit of the scant sunlight that was so necessary for life and health. Their torsos were stout, their limbs not lanky, they preserved every bit of the precious warmth within. Their noses were narrower, warming up the chill air as they inhaled it into their lungs. And yet there was a tremendous variety. Those in the farthest north had blue or green eyes, and were tall in stature. There were whole tribes of blonde or red-haired people. In the snow-capped mountains further south roamed men of shorter stature but large barrel chests, their eyes and hair of darker hues. Across the continent, their faces, their features, their physical forms were being carved by the glaciers as surely as the landscape of Europe itself. From across those long millennia she heard Edelston's voice, still talking by the fire after all these generations. The sound of it began to draw her back to that place in the woods. As her last act in this long ago time and place, on padded paws she approached a pool of still water and looked intently at the surface. What greeted her was no longer wolf, but dog. And then all that she had seen, all she had lived through, began to fade at the insistence of the present, at the clamor of this moment, as a dream does upon waking. But she did not feel it had been a dream, even though only a moment had passed. A tear streamed down her cheek, for in spite of all the pain she had witnessed, she knew the joy, too, an awakening of the self that comes only after the pain of birth. She cried, too, because she knew that she could never communicate what she had seen, what she had experienced in those full lifetimes crowded into one moment. Edelston, unaware of any change, was staring into the fire. Our bodies are so different that when doctors transplanted organs from a person of one race to another, quite often the body would reject it entirely. Even our blood is so different that hospitals would quietly keep supplies of it separated by race, saving themselves hours of screening for disorders that this or that race had never known. The races differ more than many other species of animals do from one other. In fact, when Europeans first came to Africa and encountered the Bushmen, their unions tended to produce only female offspring, many of them infertile. Before the retribution, whites were obsessed with saving what they called endangered species, and all the sub-varieties within those species. No one else cared as much as they did about the tiniest bird, reptile, or insect, provided it was in any way different, the pattern of the fur, the coloration of the wings. How strange that they were so blind to their own approaching extinction. Even a century ago, they were not even reproducing their own numbers. Meanwhile, all the other races flooded in, hastening the day when the world will have only one color of hair and one color of eyes. Phoebe, exhausted by her experience, could no longer hold her head up. Edelston, observing her nod off, misinterpreted it. "I'm sorry to keep you up like this." "No, Edelston, it's not that. I saw what you were saying. I was there, but it's too much for me. I know I'm not making much sense," she thought. "But don't think badly of me. Edelston, don't leave me tonight. Stay by me. I will, Phoebe, I will." He helped her to bed, and it was all she could do to stay awake those few moments. Stay by me. I will, Phoebe, I will. He helped her to bed, and it was all she could do to stay awake those few moments until he lay down beside her. Though the sleeping bag separated them, she laid her head on his chest, and he curled an arm around her. Then came oblivion. Once more, however, her slumber was interrupted by the sight of the great cat he had called a cougar. Her head was still resting on Ethelston's chest when she opened her eyes to find those yellow-green orbs staring right back at her from where the fire's light yielded to darkness. Ethelston's chest moved in the slow rhythm of one in a deep sleep. She was on the verge of waking him, when she saw a second pair of eyes, just like the first, emerge from the shadows. There were two of them. Side by side they watched her quietly, displaying no teeth, no overt sign of hostility. If she were to wake Ethelston, the cats might spring forward, and one he might be able to handle one, but not both. And so she lay there, watching those pairs of eyes watching her, until sleep came, or else the dream ended. Phoebe awoke in the gray light of early dawn. At first she thought herself a wolf once more, for the memory of all those mornings was still with her, though faded through the ages as memory must be. It was with some surprise, then, that she propped herself up and found hands, and not paws, supporting her. She had never had an experience like the night before and couldn't even begin to explain it to Ethelston. Whatever it was, she concluded, it was clearly within my mind, because I never left the campfire. But the cougars, either that happened or I dreamt it. Ethelston soon returned from washing himself in a nearby stream. He was intrigued to learn of the cougars' apparent return, yet the presence of two of them confused him. Cougars, he explained, did not mate for life like the wolf, but were solitary creatures. Still, he was reluctant to dismiss it as a dream. He carefully examined the ground where she said they'd been, but the leaves made it hard to say for sure whether an animal had been there. Words. For that, she was grateful. It was quite a bit colder that day, and the wind that bit into their faces felt more like November than October. The autumn colors, vying with the hardy evergreen, were noticeably sharper in contrast than when they had set out 4 days ago. Heading northeast in the valley of the Iron Shield, they kept the chill at bay as long as they were moving, and hiked on until noon. After a little food, Phoebe eagerly picked up Leonida's book. She briefly looked through the sketches and maps again, then passed toward the end of the volume, where she found these words. To my son. She looked up at Ethelston, who was off examining the bark of a tree. What sort of a man was he, really? Every time she peeled back a layer, there was another one underneath. Where did he live before he came to the Garth? How did he come there? Turning back to the book, she found herself reading the narrative of a man who knew death would be arriving soon. Ethelston, noble stone, they say it means. A fitting name, for you have learned to be as hard as rock to face this world. You will need to be, if you want to take up my trade. But where are you? I know of course that you are in the trials, that you have left with the other boys for Bear Garth. Did you reach that place of utter ruin? They sent a rider to give you the news and bear you back, but that may take days. I do not have so long. I have done what I can. I have translated all the things written here as best I could. The paths, the clues, my tools from 3 decades of scavenging. Yet it is so little, compared to how much I could have taught you, given a few more years. They know that, too, the men's council. That's why they say I will be the last scavenger. Some of them believe it is too dangerous. There is some truth in that, for here I lie, dying of my wounds. Others say the Garth no longer needs a scavenger, that we have enough people. They are mistaken. It was never about numbers, but about individuals, one here, two there, trapped in the outlands. The bottle has a neck, but woe to him in the neck if we seal the top. But the others, those who still see the need for a scavenger, their voices are silent now, for how I can apprentice one if I am dead. They, too, have concluded that it will end with me. If only they could see what I do in you. I have known you only a little while, little more than a year, and for more than half of that you have been in your trials. But I know the Son will be greater than the Father, and that thought brings me joy. I hope I have been a good father, in the short time given to me. No man knows the length of his thread, or where it will be cut. But how he faces the cutting of it, that is another matter. When I was a boy in Hungary, the elders spoke well of a man if he died a holy death. They did not envy the painless death of one who was drugged so much that he had no idea what was happening. They admired the one who made his peace with full knowledge of his soul's passing. Lying here, I find my thoughts returning to my childhood, to the beautiful, vine-covered hills around Lake Balaton. Nearly 50 years ago it was, half a century, yet more vivid to me now than most of the later years of my life. They tell me now not to exert myself, that I should rest and not write. But what good is it to die rested, if these memories die with me? So I uncork the wine, and share some of it with you. Leonidas, my father named me. Although he died when I was 7, I remember how at night he would stir my thoughts with stories from ancient days. The war for Troy, the journeys of Odysseus, or when tiny Sparta and Athens held off all the might of Asia. I remember the vineyards from those days, green rose running forever toward mountains purple in the shadows thrown by sunrise. I grew up in the shadow of St. George Mountain and dreamt of fighting the dragon. In the ruins of Castle Shiglagit I wandered, looking down at the lake and knowing that, somewhere off to the south, my older brothers had gone to fight. One by one they departed, to wage a war every bit as heroic as the one that once brought crusading knights out of this castle, bound for Jerusalem. Phoebe looked up at Ethelstan. Here he was, a scavenger, so something must have happened. Something had changed in his favor since this had been written. What had it been? She became lost in speculation, and then Ethelstan told her they'd better move on. The book would have to wait. The wind still blew, but the midday sun brought some relief whenever they stepped out of the shadows. She looked down at her clothes. Already they were beginning to fray under the demands of the journey, made as they were of the cheapest material, whereas Ethelstan served him quite well. He had assured her, however, that when they arrived she would receive new clothes. As the afternoon wore on, Phoebe occasionally caught sight of a great bird soaring above them, its huge outspread wings motionless as it rode the air currents. Every time the tree line broke to admit more of the sky, there it was, always above them. When they stopped to eat and rest, she pointed it out, as the bird glided in a great circle above them. He nodded. That is old Jeff, my fellow scavenger. He roams the Iron Shield, and sometimes he follows me. Seeing Phoebe's quizzical look, he proceeded to elaborate. Eagles often follow the bear or the wolf, hoping to scavenge something they leave behind. Old Jeff, he follows me, or at least I kid myself that he does. The first time I entered the shield, I was only 16, and there above me I saw this great eagle, always soaring. I thought at first that he was waiting for me to die. He laughed. Maybe he still is. 2.5 centuries before, he told Phoebe, an eagle had been captured not far from these parts. A great war was then convulsing the country, a war between the states, a war between brothers. This eagle was given to a unit of soldiers from Wisconsin. Naming him Old Abe, they placed him atop a perch and took him into battle as a kind of standard. He seemed to enjoy the strife, shrieking and spreading his wings as the armies clashed. Once a bullet cut the cord that held him, and he was shot through one wing. Freed from his perch, he soared high above the lines of both armies before returning. He's like me, looking for what others have thrown away, things which we find valuable. So they pressed on, with an eagle as companion. It rained that afternoon, more insistently than the day before. Edelston located a place where they could wait out the worst of it. Under a large rock overhang, Phoebe pulled out Leonida's book, while Edelston watched the rain. His long moments of silence no longer made her self-conscious. She knew it to be his natural state, betokening nothing more than a mind running down paths of memory and possibility. Using the book as an excuse, she watched him. He seemed so confident, so complete in himself. Does he need me? She wondered. Of course not. But I want him to. I want him to somehow be complete and strong and confident and yet empty and helpless without me. But it's foolish to think such things. So she turned her attention to the book. In it, Leonidas had conjured up the lost world of his childhood, the land that generations had tilled, the village where he was born, the people whom he loved. But it was a boyhood lived on the knife edge of existence, for he watched as, first his father, then his 3 older brothers, went off to fight and never returned. A Muslim horde calling itself the Army of the Golden Caliphate was sweeping across western Hungary. Leonida's mother fled with the family to Budapest. The capital was bombarded daily by planes from France and Britain, but the walls of the besieged city, though built in haste, held against the armies camped outside. Despite all this, his memories were not the stuff of nightmares. Clearly, he was proud of his people who refused to give up. Phoebe could see that in its last, desperate stand, his nation had stripped itself of everything that was not essential to survival. As he put it, the Hungarians, at least, recognized that by an iron law of nature, a race whose women do not bear children and whose men do not fight will vanish. Nature has not set aside any portion of the earth for any creature, reserving it in perpetuity, regardless of that creature's ability to fend for itself. Rather, every piece of land belongs to those, and only to those, who can hold it. Many have forgotten this basic truth. The rain had abated, and Edelston indicated they had best continue on. In the last couple hours of daylight, he led them over the northern slope and out of the shield. From here on, he explained, the range ceased to climb north, but curved east, ending at what Leonidas dubbed Long Lake. Their own destination, however, lay further north. As they crossed Highway 2, now overgrown, Edelston told her that they were only a few miles from the Michigan border. There lay the pre-hunger town of Ironwood, but they would stay well away from it. It was a dangerous area, inhabited by werewolves and feral dogs. Store. Her fears became so vivid that she moved close to Edelston. I'm cold. He put his arm about her as they sat side by side. She continued to shudder until he positioned himself around her, enclosing her with his arms and legs and holding her close. If only this would last forever, she thought. Tell me more about the Garth, about the founders. She felt his chest slowly rise and lower behind her as he gathered his thoughts. Last night I told you of a certain reality that the founders were willing to face, the reality of race. But I spoke only of the body, as important as that is, far more than most people think. Now there were some people who would acknowledge these biological differences, but they would never admit that these striking outward contrasts corresponded to anything on the inside. They insisted, as illogical as it sounded, that vastly different environments acting upon different races over thousands of years had resulted in exactly the same mental capacity. In other words, they denied that the races had unique minds equipped to deal with the specific challenges each had faced. But to the founders, these truths were self-evident. As Phoebe listened to his voice and watched the flames dance, once more she felt a tingling sensation. She leaned against his chest, even as she felt herself falling back into a world none but she could ever know. Her arms became lighter, lifting her up. This time she was a hawk, gliding on outstretched wings, her keen eyes searching the ground far below. Independent of the earth, she ranged much further now, her preternatural span of life carrying her across continents. She flew over sunlit lands in the south where winter never came. The dark-skinned people below her were no less fitted by nature for the world they lived in than those others she had known, far to the north. Here, heat, not cold, was the hammer that pounded relentlessly, forging a body that was designed to shed warmth, not preserve it. On long limbs these people chased after the animals of the plain, needing speed more than strength to catch their prey. On the savanna or in the dense jungle, they struggled against beasts and diseases and challenges unknown to the far north. Soaring high above, she saw that when they failed in the hunt, they did not starve, for here the earth yielded food year-round. They did not spend half the year storing food for the other half, for the icy monarch who annually came to reign in the north was forever shut out of this domain. Their homes, when they built them, were not needed for survival. No one spent long days filling in every chink to guard against a cold wind that never came. They had their joys and their sorrows, which none but them could know, and the stories they told, the virtues they praised, were their own. Coasting down, she spied a dark-skinned man leaving behind a woman, who called after him in despair. On a nearby tree Phoebe perched, watching this woman to see what became of her. As the weeks passed, the woman's belly began to swell, and she birthed the baby made from that union. The father returned but seldom, yet neither mother nor child perished for want of food or cold of night. The baby grew up strong like his father, and she saw that he had many brothers, born to other women but sons of the same father, a great warrior dressed in animal skins. She heard Ethelstan's voice, borne by the wind from a world away. What does it mean? How does it change the mind? When one people has to plan unceasingly, and put off pleasure, and build with foresight, just to live, and another people need do none of these things. And what if that goes on for tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, as nature mercilessly kills off those in the north who cannot plan or reason sufficiently? North she flew, then east, across the yawning breadth of a continent she had never seen before. She coasted over treeless plains, where cold winds forged a race of shorter stature, with squinted eyes. Across the vast landmass they spread, finding fertile lands but also a new enemy, water itself, surging rivers bursting their bounds to savage the land. To meet this challenge, Phoebe watched as great men arose, men who harnessed the multitude for tasks of stupendous effort, taming the rivers and diverting their flow to enrich the soil. Worshipped they were, these god-emperors of vision and will. They ruled a race capable of great sacrifice, a race for whom obedience and conformity were the keys to survival. These peoples valued intelligence, provided it was predictable and controllable. West now she soared, back to the lands she had once trod as a wolf, now winging her way through the mountain peaks, now diving down into the valleys. When this land was verdant with life, the people rejoiced, but half of their mind was always on the coming death, when the earth would produce no food. The person who lacked the discipline to plan, who would not delay the nearer pleasure for a happiness that was far off and uncertain, was pruned from the tree by nature itself. They valued hard work, these people, but not as the herd does. While always willing to help, they put a premium on self-reliance and ingenuity. For they did not have swarms of men to expend upon enormous projects. They had to innovate constantly, and they allowed the least among them the freedom to come forward with a solution. She recognized here the redneck knack for tinkering, the enterprise that would one day take them to the heavens. Below, she saw a woman curse a man for his infidelity, and in the long northern night he left her. Phoebe lingered long enough to see merciless cold and hunger carry off the woman, and with her the man's progeny. Without issue he died, shunned by man and granted no pardon from nature. Like the wolf and the eagle, these people chose their mates for life, and women here were held in higher regard than anywhere else. From high above, she followed these bearded men on the hunt, watching them fell the great beasts that still lumbered across the land. Only when they cooperated and trusted in each other did they succeed, and she observed that same trust again and again. In the palm outstretched to help the stranger, in the generosity that led a man to share his boon, and in the sense of fairness that punished any who would violate that trust. Every race she saw had its own ways, its own virtues, its own habits of mind, and its own physical form. Across the continents, every person gloried in his nature, and there was no shame, no embarrassment in being who he was. Here were no dark urban cauldrons where one race jostled another, and nature's patient work of millennia could be undone in a single generation. Again Ethelstan's voice came to her on the wind. Long ago, a man who observed many different peoples concluded that nature herself sets certain natural boundaries for each one. When they disregard the place that is made for them, or which they are made for, there is a price to pay. So it was when Asia in all her millions came to invade his homeland, and I can see it in all the centuries since. Men from hard lands of frost, steppe, or desert conquer the softer lands, until a life of ease seduces them away from their particular virtues. Seeking comfort, avoiding the hardest work, they come to rely upon other races. Whether they call it slavery or cheap labor, it is the death knell for their civilization. From hard lands come hard men, he said. From soft lands come soft men. 9. Yes, Phoebe thought, hard men, that is what I have seen. Men of iron, and women fit to stand by their side. With a sense of exhilaration she felt herself rise ever higher, until she found herself not in airless heights but nestled against Ethelstan's chest, his arms about her. Had it all been a half-dream, a drowsy state in which his words had created these images in her mind? After all, only a few seconds in such demi-dreams can contain hours of thought. Yes, but centuries, she wondered. I was there, and as a wolf and a hawk I did live through them. She was tired, but it was not quite the overpowering fatigue of the night before. Ethelstan felt her shake, and when he turned to look down at her, cradling her head for support, a longing for him coursed through her. Oh, I want to see him like this again and again, she thought, to have him be mine. Looking into his eyes, she saw the man who had slipped between her and death and widened that gap with every word, every touch, and she knew that she would have no other. And yet so much of him remained a mystery. She bit her lip, hesitating, then said it anyway. Ethelstan, when we get to where we're going, will you stay with me? In the short pause between question and answer, her heart pounded fiercely, and she experienced an agony of anticipation that made 3 seconds seem like an hour. Then he said, I don't have any intention of letting you go. Her heart beat even faster now, exulting in his possessiveness. She had known the love of her parents and grandparents, but this was altogether new, to feel wanted by a man who would keep her safe and fight for her. He bent down and pressed his lips against hers, and it was like soft fire. He kissed with the need of someone who had searched ages for something and finally found it, and she kissed him with the passion of a woman first awakened to her beauty and worth. When their lips finally parted, they were both out of breath. Shaken by the intensity of their feelings, by a silent consent they held back. For a long while, they merely clung to each other, and when they lay down for sleep, it was in each other's arms. Phoebe lay with her head on his chest, trying to take in this new reality, a world that had someone in it just for her, a world in which she was the answer to someone else's wish. It was too much to take in, and in happy bewilderment she drifted off to sleep. And then the cougars came. Silently they appeared where firelight faded into blackness. She no longer feared to move, for this had happened twice before, and if they had wanted to attack, they had had ample opportunity. So she sat up slowly, as Ethelstan beside her continued to sleep. Her movement caused no change in them, provoked no malice. In their eyes she found only an unfathomable otherness that unsettled her more than anything sinister could. A rustle of leaves announced another visitor, and into the space between the two cougars stepped a woman. She possessed a beauty beyond words, a radiance that defied label or comparison. When Phoebe looked at her hair, she saw that it was gold through and through, yet when she looked at the face framed by that hair, the hair was fiery red. Looking back at the hair, she saw clearly that it was gold, but not when Phoebe beheld the face again, and the burning colors of dawn returned. As her eyes traced the lines of the woman's figure downward, the hair at the top of her vision darkened from auburn to the brown of Phoebe's own hair until, at the woman's bare feet, the tresses on her head above appeared as black as night. The woman's eyes, likewise, refused classification. Seen straight on, they were luminously blue, yet if Phoebe looked at one, it was brown like the bark on the trees, and when she looked at the other, it was green like the pine needles those trees bore. But it was the woman's form above all that entranced Phoebe. It, too, seemed to shift emphasis depending upon what her eyes focused on. View her as a whole, and she was perfectly proportioned, no part detracting from another, all in perfect harmony. But only gaze upon one part, and it seemed the most perfect, indeed the only, thing in the universe. Her sensuous lips turned in a smile, her full breasts only half covered, her waist, her hips, her hands, her feet. Stopping at each, Phoebe wondered how anyone could care about anything else in the universe. And yet the woman's appearance did not appear to change, but rather to remain constant, for at any moment, she seemed to be exactly the one thing the viewer wanted her to be. Through it all, the woman's skin shone as white as snow, and upon her breast lay a necklace like none Phoebe had ever imagined. Once, her grandmother had shown her an old necklace that she said was amber. It looked like dark honey to Phoebe, yet was hard to the touch. It had flowed out of trees long ago, Grandma had said, and before it hardened, specks of plants and insects had been caught inside. These, instead of detracting from its beauty, made the pendant even more wondrous. Now Phoebe was looking at an amber that had somehow caught all her own memories, all the moments she treasured of her family, playing out before her, each preserved forever in the amber's luster. Phoebe noticed that the leaves were still rustling, and the wind rising up at the woman's feet was causing her dress to billow. That dress, blue-black and iridescent, seemed to be made out of birds' feathers and butterfly wings. As it moved in the breeze, these seemed alive, as if at any moment the dress might dissolve into a cloud of butterflies and birds flying away and leave the woman naked. Phoebe felt something tug at her breast. Looking down, she was surprised to see her undershirt pushed up and a baby nursing there. A feeling of fulfillment like she had never known ran through her, to have a life dependent on her, clinging, needy, and trusting, while she had everything that that life required. Somehow she knew that this was her baby, a child she would one day have. The rustle of leaves stopped, and she looked up to see the woman open her lips and say, "Phoebe," and the voice was like the tinkling of chimes. The woman smiled, and when Phoebe felt the tug again, she looked down to find that it was Edelston sucking at her breast. This time, she felt a similar feeling of completeness, only it was not the nourishing of life but the kindling of desire that brought it on. She wanted Edelston, but even stronger than her desire was the full knowledge that he wanted her. The realization came with the force of a thunderclap. She was to be this woman to him, an endless source of fascination and desire, the very kindling by which life's spark might blaze up and burn bright. The leaves began to rustle again, but when Phoebe looked up, it was only to see the woman stepping barefoot into the dark forest, trailed by the cougars, their lithe steps an echo of her sinuous movement. When she was gone, Phoebe looked back at Edelston, but he was in a deep sleep, and there was no sign that he, much less a baby, had been at her breast, save for a tenderness she still felt there. She lay down next to him and replayed the encounter in her mind, over and over. Sometimes she saw the woman's face, sometimes her own, and so it went, on and on until she surrendered to sleep. Phoebe awoke with a start. Edelston was nudging her. It was still mostly dark, and in that odd state between dreaming and wakefulness, she thought that the glow in the distance was twilight, not dawn, and that for some odd reason he was trying to nudge her to sleep. He explained. Not so the woman. Phoebe tried to describe the woman's appearance, but found to her frustration that, like any dream, nothing conveyed to the listener the full power and coherence of such a private revelation. To her surprise, however, Edelston was not as ready as she was to dismiss it as fantasy. When she mentioned the necklace, his eyes widened as if in sudden recognition, and again he asked her to describe the woman's appearance. Beautiful. Simply, radiantly beautiful. I'm afraid I can't do better than that. I can remember the way I felt when I saw her, but every time I try to recall something specific about her, it seems to change. To Phoebe, all this only seemed to confirm it was a dream, but Edelston was furrowing his brow in thought. 2 cats, he muttered to himself. Why didn't I see it? He looked up at Phoebe, and in his eyes she saw something new. Wonder bordering on fear. This was disconcerting to find in someone she thought to be firmly grounded in the grittiness of reality. In silence they turned to the business of packing their bags. Soon it was light enough, and they set off on the 6th day of their journey. Edelston kissed her at their departure, and for long thereafter her lips tingled at the memory of his touch. My Edelston, she thought possessively, and it felt wonderful to own and be owned. For a long while, they continued to skirt the iron shield, but to the northeast, the land opened up. They soon came to the dark waters of the Black River. This, Edelston said, would take them to the northern sea, where they would camp that night. Phoebe sat down on a flat rock near the river and took out Leonida's book. Edelston walked about, but from time to time she caught him watching her, as if he were nervous. She read how, under the threat of annihilation, Leonida's people had transformed even their faith into something she could scarcely recognize. Edelston had told her of how the church in Europe, where it survived at all, had fractured into its national components, as each went their own way. In Hungary, the panicked fight for survival combined with the urgent needs of popular devotion to reduce it, or perhaps amplify it, to blood, and the life that blood carried. Budapest had been under siege for a year on the day I was sent to fight. First the city had called up the boys on the edge of manhood, then it drafted the 14 and 15-year-olds, and then the 13-year-olds were armed, and I among them. We stood in the square before St. Stephen's Basilica. Its spires had been hit by artillery, and there was a hole in the dome, but the walls still stood. Smoke from that day's bombardment filled the sky and the streets about us, making it seem that this square and the buildings facing it were all that existed. We stood in open ranks formation facing the Patriarch of Budapest, who stood on a platform. Behind us were our families. The Patriarch raised his hand in benediction, and as one body we knelt. I remember how my knees ached from the cold stones as I waited for the priest to move down the line, sprinkling holy water. And then the Patriarch held up the vial containing the blood of Saint Łukasz, who had been martyred 2 decades before on this, his feast day. As we watched, those in the front row whispered as the dried blood liquefied, and the Patriarch tilted the vial to show the miracle had occurred. Then he did something extraordinary, doing us great honor by it. He had his attendants insert a needle into the vial, and they let fall a drop of that holy blood into the consecrated wine. And so we knew that every boy that day would receive some of the valor of Saint Łukasz, for the cup would not be washed until all had drunk. When I received that gift, though it was very cold that day, I felt a warmth within. When we finally rose from our knees, I almost swooned. Then we turned about, and our mothers were behind us, walking down the rows. If a boy's mother were dead, a woman of her line took her place. There was Anya, mother, so much younger than I am now, looking at me as if I were still her little child. With the other mothers, she pulled down the top of her blouse a bit, and I could see the 3 scars on her bosom from my older brothers, now dead. She made a little cut with a knife, and blood streamed out. With tears in her eyes, she pressed my face to her breast. "Once again I bleed for you," she said. Scars. He had not shirked his duties those years when I was fatherless. I had feared his anger, but I feared his quiet disappointment more. Now he took my own knife from its sheath, drew his arm across his chest, and in an instant made a slash across my cheek. The scar is still there, on my left cheek, because Miklos was left-handed. I winced from the searing pain, but I did not cry out, nor did any boy there, and that silence I still find amazing. "Once again I challenge you," he said in his gruff voice, "this time for the taking of life." I let the cut bleed, dripping down on my shirt, so that I would not fear blood again. Miklos wiped off the blade and handed it to me, and I sheathed it. Then he handed me a rifle and its magazine, loaded with 10 rounds. Any more would be a waste, so short were we on ammunition, and so likely was it that most of us would die at the outset. The survivors would arm themselves from the dead. He placed 1 extra round in my pocket, to save for myself if I were on the point of capture. Then he clasped me firmly on the shoulders with his strong, weathered hands. It was as if I could feel his strength entering me. He stepped back, and the families stepped to the sides as we formed up. The church bells, still hanging from the crumbling towers, began to ring out. We marched out past our families, who lined our path. As I neared the end of the square, out the corner of my vision I could see my sister, Greta. She was 2 years younger. I remember wanting to look at her one last time, but instead I kept my head straight forward like the soldier I was. I still regret that to this day. How I long to see her once more. Here Leonidas had made a sketch of his sister's face. It lacked, perhaps, the artistic perfection Phoebe had seen in Edelston's book of paintings, but it was drawn with the same eye for detail the man had lavished upon each carefully drawn map, or in the sketching of a plant that might save one's life. She looked up. Edelston was waiting. It was time to resume their journey, and follow the windings of the Black River as it flowed on. Up ahead, on their side of the river, a great hill loomed out of the surrounding plain. Atop it stood something man-made but impossibly tall. As they neared, the structure began to resemble a giant slide, extending the hill's slope perhaps 100 meters higher. Edelston told her it was Copper Peak. Long ago they made that slope for skiing, where you slide down the snow on long slats. You would take a lift to get to the top of the hill, then ride an elevator hundreds of feet up. It's been decades since any of that worked, but you can still climb to the top. From up there, you can see for hundreds of miles, even to the other side of the Northern Sea. Leonidas called it the high seat. He looked back at her, and his eyes sparkled. "All to take you up there. We've got time, and you may not get the chance again." She was unable to resist. When they reached the base of the peak, they came to an abandoned building, its roof partly caved in. Following Edelston inside, Phoebe found herself in a large room that had once offered visitors food, gifts, and pictures from the past. The steep V of the high ceiling made it appear like an ancient hall. Looking at the pictures of men and women long gone unnerved her, and she walked back outside into the sun. Edelston came out soon after, and they continued on to a sign. It read, "Copper Peak Adventure Ride," and identified 1970 as the year it was built, nearly a century and a half ago. A hulking metal contraption, once painted red but now rusted and chipped, connected the cables that followed the slope of the hill up from this point, but the machine no longer ran, and the chairs swung idly in the wind. They left their packs there and began to walk up the hill underneath the cables, where forest growth had reclaimed the ground. The climb was steep, but Phoebe had overcome many challenges in 5.5 days of journeying. At the top of the hill, they paused for breath, and she looked up. marveling at the slide or ski jump as Edelston had called it. Taller buildings stood in many apples, she knew, but there was something about the structure's shape and position that made it appear even more massive than its already impressive size. Extending upward in a slope that veered more and more to the vertical, it seemed to be an unfinished bridge to the sky, pointing to the space where once the white man had orbited the Earth and set his foot upon the moon. Leaving the planet was surely a more stupendous achievement than building this, but that feat was hard for her to imagine, rendering it unreal for all practical purposes. This, however, she could see and touch, and the fact that it was built purely for amusement made its size even more outlandish. What had the whites been thinking before the retribution? Were they amusing themselves right up to the very end, too busy to notice the shifting of the earth beneath their feet, unwilling to face the certainty that everything they built, everything they cared about, would one day be handed over to people completely unlike themselves? Or maybe, she speculated, they were so anxious to fill the emptiness inside that amusement became the only reason worth living, a purpose comfortably limited to one human lifetime. Then they need not worry about the future. In fact, they might even envy their descendants for the technological wonders they would surely amuse themselves with. She recalled something her grandma had said, that whites used to treat their dogs better than their own children. They had built resorts for their pets where they were pampered like rich people. They would even call them their children. But actual offspring they had little time for. Instead, they used their technology to find new ways to render themselves infertile. Now the descendants of those pampered dogs roam the depopulated towns in feral packs. Before the retribution, whites' biggest concern was being able to alter their sex at will, denying their gender since they could not so quickly deny their race. With righteous indignation, they demanded the right to take any drug they wished in order to escape the reality they had made. It was said that when the retribution came, whites were busy using their most ingenious sciences to make robots that looked like women and even spoke and moved like them. In this way, men could seek their pleasures in a fruitless union, leaving no children, no sign that they had ever lived. Phoebe had heard rumors that some of these engineers, shunning the redneck fate, still worked on perfecting these lifeless women. From workshops in the worst part of the seeds, they sold the services of these machines to men whose posterity was cut off not by choice, as before the retribution, but by necessity. She looked up at this awesome edifice of metal and wood that extended toward the heavens. No, this was not like that, she decided. There was something about this that challenged you, dared you, made you better if you could overcome it. And so she resumed the climb. A rope hung down several meters from the end of the ski jump. Edelston climbed up first, then hauled her up as she hung on. Weather and lack of care had aged the structure, and wind-blown soil had taken root, enough for weeds to grow. The wood groaned underfoot, and the steel frame creaked, yet the work of the pre-ret engineers held as the frigid wind whipped about their heads. Halfway up, she had to stop, for the steepness of the slope here was unforgiving, and the muscles in her thighs burned. Edelston stopped with her, and as she looked about, he began to recite a poem she had never heard. Wondrous these walls, destroyed by destiny, the city smashed, the work of giants laid waste, roofs going to ruin, towers toppled, crossbeams caving in, cement scored by weather, ceilings storm-torn, ravaged and wrecked, feast for the fire. Earth embraces the mighty makers, dissolved and departed, gripped by the ground. Legions of lifetimes, a folk faded away. Bright once these buildings, scores of spas, spires soaring, voices valorous, merriment in the mead hall, packed with people, until force of fate ended everything. Men fell far and wide, days of war and disease, death dealt the brave a lasting blow. Their battlements abandoned, their farms fruitless, towns torn down. The menders met death, hosts of men heaped up. This is why these dwellings are dreary. 10. What is that from? Phoebe asked, mesmerized by the words. It is a poem called The Ruin. It was written many centuries ago, when the poet beheld the ruins that the Romans left behind. Was. She gripped the side and walked away from the edge out onto the metal walkway, but the holes in the metal tread revealed nothing beneath but treetops far below. Only when she had caught her breath did she dare to look around. There she saw the Black River, a thin break in the trees extending into the distance, until it met a blue darker than the sky. Endless. There, far away, lay the shores of Canada, but they could not be seen. Turning about, she saw that they had nearly reached the edge of a different kind of sea, a sea of trees in dark green, dull yellow, and rust red. The Iron Wood, Edelston called it. He pointed southwest, where trees ran on forever. That is where they had come from. Then he directed her gaze northeast, where low peaks broke up the horizon. That's where we're headed, the Drakensberg, the Dragon Mountains. Before the Retribution, he explained, the range bore the name Porcupine Mountains. But when the Boers came through on their trek to find a new home, they renamed it the Drakensberg. Envy. This they defended against those who came later, the British as well as the African tribes of the Xhosa and Zulu. Although they'd largely kept themselves separate from the Africans, the Boers relied upon them for labor, which they would come to realize, too late, as a fatal mistake. They had also bestowed upon the Africans modern medicine, and built them hospitals and schools, only to watch their numbers multiply far beyond those of the whites. Black employment there was higher than anywhere else on the continent, and more of them streamed into the country even as the rest of the world, from a comfortably sanctimonious position, condemned the ruling whites for their racial separation and cut off trade. The Afrikaners, as the whites had come to call themselves, mistakenly thought that giving in would grant them peace, even though they had the example of Rhodesia to their north, the first country to experience the Retribution. When the Retribution came to them next, it was swift. A people who had been living on the continent for centuries were dubbed latecomers. White farmers, who had made the land so rich that the country exported food, were now marked for murder, shut in front of their families while the government looked the other way. South Africa became the first rainbow nation. Whites were systematically purged from government, business, and education through the methods later adopted by the Red Act, and white ghettos sprang up. Despite it all, many Afrikaners found they could not part with the land of their ancestors' graves, and these people were eventually enveloped in darkness. But others fled the country, becoming part of a diaspora that spread across Canada, America, and Australia. Had things stayed that way, it was likely that by the end of the century, no recognizable Afrikaner nation would have existed. But fate intervened. Settled among the white nations in isolated pockets, Afrikaners were the first to recognize the familiar signs as the Retribution began. Some of them began to buy up land, forming their own settlements in rural areas. When the Red Act confiscated the whites' land, and the hunger came, these Afrikaners took to the hinterlands. In a symbolic act of defiance, they adopted the Boer name once more and declared their independence. The Boers' language was Afrikaans, derived mostly from Dutch, although many of them knew English. It was said that their language was quite close to the form of English that the poet had used centuries ago, when he beheld the ruins of a vanished race. Edelston had spent some time with them and could speak to them in their own tongue. They've been in this area for over half a century. Far beyond those mountains, nearly as far as we've walked so far, lies a peninsula that the Boers call the Oudtshoorn, after Hoden, a town that used to be there. It means, old toe, in their language, for the point juts out into the northern sea like the end of a foot. Midway down the foot, the peninsula is cut off by a river, formed partly by nature, partly by man. There the Boers have built fortifications, and they guard them well. Did they fear attack? He continued to look into the distance, and nearly half a minute went by before he spoke. See. sharp peaks and beetling crags. Ours, you'll find, are not so awe-inspiring, although once they were, for they are among the oldest mountains in the world, worn down over billions of years. But the Boers have quite a sense of humor. But we're not headed to their settlement, she said, making sure she understood. Journey. While he ventured back inside the old hall once built for tourists, she sat down, the aches in her body retreating as her attention focused on Leonida's book. We marched across the Danube on the ancient chain bridge, and then we were in Buda. All the families had long since been moved to Pest, on the eastern side of the river, so now we were among soldiers only. The tolling of the bells became distant, but now we could hear a different sound, growing in volume, the sound of explosions, gunfire, and screaming. Some of the boys, but we were men now, weren't we? The tolling of the bells became distant, but now we could hear a different sound, growing in volume, the sound of explosions, gunfire, and screaming. Some of the boys, but we were men now, weren't we, soiled themselves in fear. I would have, too, only I suddenly remembered that I had the holy blood in me, the blood of Saint Łukasz, who died defending the 47 martyrs. Thinking on that gave me courage. As we neared the walls, flashing erupted to our right in the gathering twilight, and the earth shook. It was the artillery to the north, as the older men, veteran units, were trying to draw the enemy's focus to the Arpad Gate. But we were headed for another gate, Lajos, named for a young king who fought the Turks. It was as the popular children's rhyme of that time said, 6 gates have the walls of Buda. They used that rhyme to help us remember the steps in firing our AKs. When we reached the walls, it was already dark. There were older soldiers at the Lajos, and even though they couldn't have been more than 20, they seemed impossibly old to us. Many of them had suffered serious injuries, but they were kind to us and gave us food. Many of my comrades found they had no stomach for food, but I wolfed it down. I wanted every ounce of energy to fight the enemy. That night seemed to stretch on forever. The flash of artillery and streaks of anti-aircraft rounds made it seem like a kind of horrid daytime, and in my imagination I thought the sun would never come up again, that this would be the only light the earth would ever know. Then we were ordered out, and suddenly it seemed to me that we had only just arrived, that but a minute had passed. All that followed is a blur to me, a series of moments with space in between that my mind cannot connect. Or is all memory like that? I see a sergeant major, a huge bear of a man, and hear his deep voice singing the Adelaide Portas. It was the ancient hymn Open the Gates, taken from the Descent into Hell. Other veterans joined in. When the line came, "It is the Lord, strong and mighty in battle," those heavy gates creaked open. There, before us, lay the night land. The next moment I can remember is crawling on top of one of the boys in my platoon, who had been shot through the head. I took his magazine and the unused round from his pocket. At that moment, I realized, strangely, that I could recall the names of all the boys in my platoon but him. And it seemed sad to me, it always has, that I could not remember his name. Then I remember running toward the enemy, for we were part of a great charge, and to break through the enemy line was our one hope. I kept expecting a bullet to hit me any second, but to keep from going crazy I recited some of the names of our heroes, beginning with the most recent, Saint Łukasz, and Admiral Horthy, and on back to Hunyadi Janos, King Bela, Saint Laszlo and Saint Istvan, and then I was before the Christians with Arpad, and before him I did not know any. So I simply repeated, "Their blood runs in my veins," again and again as I ran through the gunfire. I do not clearly remember the first man I killed, for there were so many that night, and in all the days and nights to follow. It seems to me that they all bore one face. It took all my strength to kill with the blade, for I was young, but I found that if I kept reciting the ancestors and heroes, often a berserker frenzy would take hold of me. At such times, taking a man's life became as easy and as natural as breathing. This same berserker rage dwells within you, too, my son. I know that as my apprentice you have killed, and I know you did it with forethought and judgment. That is as it should be, for killing is a serious matter. But someday, when you need it, the battle rage will take hold of you, and you will know what a gift it is. It took us a night, and the next day, and the following night, but we broke the siege of Budapest. But we did not return to the city. Given scarcely any rest, we kept pressing down the west bank of the river, always to the south. There we joined the Serbs and cleared the Caliphate army from Belgrade. Then we moved east, and Polish volunteers followed along the north side of the river, across the Carpathian Mountains. Then came a battle besides which that for my own city was but a skirmish. The jihadis had made a surprise attack on Romania, and the force of their fury became known as the Rape of Bucharest. Street by street we fought in that city, until there were no more streets, just rubble, and then we fought in that. It was there that I lost my eye. But in the end, vengeance was ours, the Golden Caliph was slain, and his armies fled south. But the joy of that victory came to end when I heard that my mother and little Greta had perished in a bombing. To Budapest I did not wish to return, nor to the grapevine hills around Lake Balaton. I was 15 years old now, but in body and soul I felt years older. I had had enough of fighting. So I headed north, away from the cursed jihadis. Phoebe looked up to see Edelston emerging from the building, bearing a book and a map. Reluctantly, she put Leonida's account away, and they put on their packs. Rejoining the river, they followed it northwest toward the sea. As they walked, Phoebe felt uncannily as if someone were watching them from the high seat, and she turned around. She could see no one, but at that moment 2 birds flew from the very top, black against the sky. The river made tight bends that they didn't always follow, for Edelston would sometimes strike out straight into the trees, only to encounter the river a while later. For all its twists and turns, the river seemed eager to reach the sea. After a couple of hours, she heard the rush of water. Here the river split in two around a huge rock, forming 2 waterfalls. Soon they came to another falls, this one narrower and rushing faster. For the next hour, they followed the river down past several waterfalls, until they reached a footbridge and crossed to the other side. Walking down river on this side, they followed a tight bend, and then the sea was before them once more. The trees, as if not wanting to surrender, grew right up to the water's edge, where they rooted themselves in the rocks, their roots exposed. A line of rocks had been laid out far into the water, twinned by another rocky barrier on the other side of the river's mouth, and together they formed a small harbor. Edelston went to gather wood for the fire, but when she made to help him, he insisted that she explore the beach before it got too dark to do so. As she walked along the sand, stepping over driftwood, the sun lay hidden behind a line of low blue clouds on the horizon, but its blaze reached beyond to paint the sky above in red, orange, and pink. She stepped out carefully on the line of rocks, until the water was all around her, save for the narrow line leading back to land. The vastness of the sea overwhelmed her. It had been impressive enough from the high seat, but here it became a thing of awe. All of the lakes they had encountered could be poured in it and would not make it rise a millimeter. And it was deep, so deep, Edelston had said, that if it were poured out, its contents would cover the entire continents of North and South America in a foot of water. But then it wouldn't be a sea, he observed. Mixed in, shallow, it would lose its character and become a swampy sludge. Better that it is small, but deep. But it did not look small from where she was standing. It was as though they had traveled for days only to find they were on an island. Yet she knew there was land on the other side of this sea. A bird shrieked behind her, and she half expected old Jeff to appear, but instead it was a white bird with a long beak that flew past her, on its way out to sea. Toward the setting sun it soared, almost motionless as it rode the winds. The cold breeze stirred something dreamlike in her. Her thoughts were a dizzy mix of boars and werewolves, eagles and mountain lions, ironwoods and copper mountains, boy soldiers and radiant women, great battles and private acts of violence, the intimacy she and Ethelstan had shared and all that she wanted yet to share with him, until she felt that all this must be a dream. Surely she was lying in bed, in the south seat of many apples, firmly in the clutches of the retribution. Could one dream within a dream? Not quite accustomed to the fact of the northern sea, she walked back to the beach, then took off her shoes to enjoy the feel of sand between her toes. The water was cold, but she enjoyed the feeling as she walked along its edge. Turning the corner, she was no longer in sight of where they were going to camp. Stealthily, she crouched and took her clothes off, one by one, and then quickly skipped into the sea. The water was bracing, and her heart immediately began to beat faster, but never had she felt more alive. After a few minutes, she looked back at the darkening tree line and, finding herself alone, emerged from the water and hastily put on her clothes. Her teeth clacking, she returned to the camp, relieved to find Ethelstan already had a fire burning. He looked up. We're very close now, only about 20 miles away. We'll be able to get there by late afternoon tomorrow. Miles. Phoebe had heard the term, but was unfamiliar with how much distance it conveyed. In remaking the signs and place names from the evil times, the Retribution had also rectified the ancient and illogical system of measurements which that benighted era had employed. About 30 kilometers, he replied. The mile, he explained, was once part of an entire system of measurements that fit the human scale, units that were readily understandable. A mile was originally 1,000 paces, measured by the march of Roman soldiers across Europe. Of late, the Rangers, a group that ventured out of the Garth, had adopted an even older measurement, the league, which was the distance one could walk in an hour. Its length changed depending on the difficulty of the terrain, but in doing so it conveyed important information. It's funny that the Retribution saw fit to adopt the metric system, yet another invention of White's. If only Whites had reigned in their desire to constantly improve the rest of the world, we might not be in this mess. He stretched and yawned. Soon, though, you won't have to rough it anymore. Unfamiliar with their destination and what comforts it might offer, Phoebe had no basis of comparison, but as it was, she would be happy to spend forever with Ethelstan, roaming the forests and never quite arriving anywhere. The realization that this would be their last night alone saddened her and made her feel more possessive. They ate in silence, and she sensed that his thoughts, too, were occupied with the changes that tomorrow would bring. After they had eaten, she boldly sat down between his legs, and he encompassed her with his arms as they faced the fire. This is what she hoped heaven would be like. The fire before them, the night sky above, and lying in the arms of this man, listening to him tell a story that had no end. Except that tonight he was silent. His words had taken her across the world, yet she knew next to nothing of his story. If only she could get him to open up. Oh, Ethelstan. So he was not born with such an odd name, as I suspected. Yes, I was on my own then. I had heard stories of places in the North Woods, where some Whites lived apart, not as the werewolves do, but in larger groups. I had heard of one group that had been destroyed utterly. But whether there were still other communities, and if so, how many and where, on that none of the rumors seemed to agree. I was moving north along the border between Wisconsin and Michigan, when I came to a small, abandoned village called Athelstane. Well, I thought it was abandoned. A band of werewolves attacked me, and I barely escaped with my life. As it was, my shirt was left in tatters from the marks of their blades upon me. Edelston's telling was spare in details, but she could guess what he was capable of. But in her mind's eye, she didn't see the heroic man who saved her, but a boy on the edge of manhood, bleeding as he made his way through the forest. She leaned back and placed one hand upon his chest, as if to comfort that boy inside the man. When I found the Garth a few days later, Leonidas said, "What happened to you?" "Athelstane," I replied, and he said, "All right, what happened to you, Athelstane?" He laughed. So that was thought to be a suitable name for me, a new name. Fitting, too, that my future adoptive father had first spoken it. I learned later that Ethelstan had been a king long ago, a great man who fought for his folk, so I used that form of the name. So your parents, they were more like your grandfather, I take it, than Leonidas. Here it comes, she thought, the moment of decision. Will he open up to me? Yes, they were. He paused, perhaps reflecting on them, perhaps debating if he should continue, but then, both my parents, despite what their families had experienced, believed that the Red Act would only be temporary, that in the end it would all sort of even out. Equality. That's what they taught me to believe in, to deny all the differences I could see in front of me, to expect that equality would somehow arrive one day. But while I had to pretend to never see the color of others, I should be ready to let them judge me by mine, to accept any guilt that they might fasten upon me. It was a religion of sorts, with a strict creed and a code of conduct all its own, with a judgment and a promised land. But sometimes I wonder if, deep down, they had doubts of their own. For a long while, the only sound was the crackle of flames, the wood hissing and popping, and the occasional owl hooting in the darkness enshrouding them. And then, without prompting, Ethelstan unrolled the scroll of his past before her. When I was 10, there was a rumor that things were better in the Northwest, that there had been a racial reconciliation, that somehow in Oregon and Washington, people had figured out how to make it work. Hardly any crime, no riots. It was everything my parents thought was possible, and so they decided to make the move. It was a hard trek to make, because we had no car. We hitched rides when we could, walked when we had to. My dad did odd jobs in exchange for food and a place to sleep. I got to see a lot of this country. After 3 months, we finally arrived at Portland. Battleground. There were gangs roaming the streets, children getting shot. The Asians were better organized and had the upper hand, and for a while we laid low in their zone, hoping some kind of order would return. But then the Asians started infighting, the Chinese versus the Filipinos, the Vietnamese versus the Laotians. The Hispanics hit back, and that's when his voice broke off, with a palpable reluctance to say more. I'm sorry, I haven't told this to anyone, not even Leonidas. Phoebe waited patiently, knowing that he would tell her in his own good time. The fire made it easier, for neither of them had to experience the intensity of the other's gaze at this moment. After a moment of silent struggle, he continued. You see, my dad was trying to get us out of the city, to where some relatives lived. A carload of Hispanics pulled up next to us. They rolled down the window and pointed a gun at his head. They were threatening to kill him for no particular reason. Ethelstan let out a long sigh. Behavior. Who goes up to a family on the street and just kills them? What justifies that? My mom was on her knees, sobbing and apologizing for everything under the sun. But it bothered me more that my dad was acting that way. I wanted him to. I didn't know what to do, but I guess I thought he would act differently. Ethelstan paused, as if grasping for some sense in it all. Then they shot my dad, right there. My mom let out a scream I will never forget, and she reached out for my father, who was lying dead on the ground. The thug pointed the gun at her and said, "White bitch." Then he shot her, too. His body tensed with the telling of it. Looking up at him, she could see a torment in his eyes that was not reflected fire. She held him, wishing she could hold the 10-year-old him. Still watching the flames, he resumed his story. She didn't deserve that. No one ever made up more excuses for people of color than she did. No matter what, according to her, they could do no wrong. There was always some excuse for what they did. But what good did it do her in the end? What happened to you? She asked quietly. I ran. I ran as fast as I could. If I had hesitated a second longer, I would have been dead. The thug fired at me, and I could hear the bullets whizzing by, and each second I thought the next one is going to hit me. But it didn't. Then he must have run out of bullets, and before the others could join in, I had hopped a fence. I ran across an empty lot and into an abandoned building. I heard the screech of their tires, but they never found me hiding there. There was nothing for me to do except head back the way we had come, to Indiana. This time I was on my own, so I kept to the back roads. It wasn't easy. Now and then, I'd meet up with a white, hoboing like myself, and I'd learn a few things. How to catch fish, how to hunt, how to fight and take care of myself. I heard a lot of stories and asked a lot of questions about what was going on in the world. There was plenty of time to think. He sighed. I often thought about my parents' last moments. Sometimes, the way a man dies, you can see how everything in his life led up to that moment. I loved my parents, but from that point on, I turned my back on the way they lived. I vowed then that no matter what, I would never beg for my life. I would hold my chin high. He smiled grimly. It's like my friend Connor says, I came into this world screaming and covered in someone else's blood, and I don't mind going out the same way. Edelston's laugh came out harsh and dry. When I finally made it back to Indiana, everything was different. Some of the boys I had grown up with were now gone. Others were dead. A few had been shot by gangs. Others had shot themselves full of drugs. The rest were already working as mechanics, in the garages or factories. But as for me, I had tasted freedom. I couldn't stomach the idea of spending my life stooped over an engine, giving my money for the ret tax, hoping to not get shot or beaten on the way home. So I hit the road again. The things I saw, the things I experienced. But that's a story for another time. Then one day I came up to these parts. And got your name. And got my name. What was your first name? The name you were born with, I mean. He sighed. That person no longer exists, Phoebe. She could have let it drop, but something prevented her. It wasn't that he was holding back a secret so much as holding back a part of himself. That boy did exist, and although Phoebe instinctively felt she was the only person on Earth who knew it, that made it all the more important that if she were to guard the lock, she should have the key. She looked up into his eyes and said, that boy does exist. And there is a place where he looks up into the night sky, and sees the same stars a little girl sees in the city, a girl who hopes there is someone like him. He kissed her then, gently, passionately. Their tongues met, and he yielded his mouth to her exploring, as if to bare his secrets to her, then matched her desire with his own. The firelight played across their faces as their lips parted and met, again and again. His mouth moved to her neck, and she leaned back in his arms. A soft kiss met her earlobe, and then she heard him whisper his name into her ear, that name from long ago. He did it even though she knew it gave her a kind of power over him, for to have a word for something is to be able to hold it in the mind and not let it go. Yet she would never betray that trust, never hurt the boy no matter how tough the man might seem. A fire moved through her then, a craving to join with him and never part, to be naked in soul and body. He felt it, too, but then he stopped. She looked into his crystal blue eyes and saw desire there, but something held him back. Time. Edelston hungered for that magic, Too, she could feel it in his touch, see it in the way he looked at her, hear it even in his silences. No matter what society said, no matter what sanctities it disregarded, this step was binding. Did he wonder if she understood that? Edelston, I want to be yours not just tonight, but forever. He smiled wistfully. It's not that. I know how you feel, and I feel the same way. I love you, Phoebe. But there are things I need to show you first, when we get there. It's so hard to explain, but I need you to see before you. She took his hand and pressed it to her lips. I can wait, but I still don't want to sleep alone tonight. They kissed again, then she rested her head upon his chest, as together they looked up through the evergreens. The night sky covered them with a canopy of diamonds, and slowly she drifted off to sleep. At some point, she awoke to find him placing her in the sleeping bag, then sliding in next to her. She murmured contentedly and placed her arms around him. The cougars did not come that night, nor did the woman. Yet Phoebe did dream, and it was no less vivid. She found herself in a forest that was iron gray, the trees and soil the same dull, lifeless color. She realized that the forest must have burned in a great fire, and the heat from the soil still managed to sear her bare feet. Spying a spot of ground that was not gray but golden, she stepped there and was relieved of the heat. Glancing down, she saw that it was in fact gold she was standing on, and that there were more such spots, here and there. Phoebe stepped from one to another, and at some point she realized that she was holding two people by the hand. It was a little boy and a girl, both about 5 years old. With an odd clarity, she understood that this was her own father and mother, and she was leading them to safety. In the strange logic of dreams, it made perfect sense. They emerged from the gray forest to arrive at the sea, lit dimly by twilight. The beach, she found, was also blistering to the touch, but here the gold spots were large pieces of amber. The three of them walked safely upon these, making their way to the water. A light rain began to fall. She looked at the sky above, and there was the woman from her encounter last night, still ravishingly beautiful but sorrowful now, the tears running down her cheeks and falling into the sea below as rain. She held out her hands, and Phoebe surrendered her parents to the woman's care. The children were not sad to be going, however, and when Phoebe looked again, a smile had broken through the woman's sadness. The rain stopped, and the sky became clear, illuminated by an impossibly large, impossibly bright moon. Phoebe noticed a shadow on the moon, and the more she studied it, the more it came to resemble an eagle. The shadow became bigger, and then she realized it was not part of the moon but separate, something flying in the sky, growing larger as it flew closer. As it neared, she saw that it was not an eagle but a great hawk, and the rhythmic flapping of its enormous wings sounded like waves. Her parents, still children, were now atop that hawk, minuscule in comparison with its size. Of the beautiful woman there was no trace, except Phoebe saw her eyes looking out from the hawk's face. She wanted nothing more than to ride atop that noble bird and be carried away, and started to run toward it. But the hawk let out a series of piercing shrieks, which she understood as speech. The words said, "Not yet, not yet," a long while still. And then the hawk flew off, its great wings wafting the air against her. Phoebe woke up on the beach, far from Edelston. It was still night. She heard water lapping on the sand near her head. Standing up, she saw the half-moon's light reflected off the rippling sea. Evidently she had walked here in her sleep, but her footprints had disappeared into the sand. She headed back to camp, stubbing her toes on driftwood. Edelston woke up when she joined him, but drifted back to sleep when she reassured him that everything was as it should be. Edelston woke her up before dawn. It was still so dark that at first she couldn't see where the beach ended and the sea began. In the confusion that slumber leaves in its wake, she thought for a moment that they were on a boat out at sea. Then she turned and saw the dark trees looming behind them. Although their imminent arrival at the Garth probably involved concerns that occupied his mind, she suspected that his thoughts, like her own, kept returning to the night before. The halt he had put to their intimacy did not bother her, for she felt that no matter what, nothing could shake her feelings for him. If I belong to him, it also means that he belongs to me. He didn't ask her about any encounters last night. His attitude toward her visions had changed from curiosity to reverence, and he must have felt that she would tell him about it in her own good time if she deemed it necessary. She wasn't sure if she should seek some significance in last night's dream, or just dismiss it as a jumble of impressions from their journey and memories from long ago. They set out at a brisk pace, sometimes walking near the coast, at other times veering inland. Soon they came to another river, and after a 5 minutes walk along its banks they encountered the first of 3 waterfalls, the last one thundering down 10 meters, its waters foaming brown and white. Further down, they crossed a footbridge, the river rushing below. Leading her up a rise, Edelston pointed out the Drakensberg, a double line of rocky peaks. By late morning, they were quite near those crags, still hugging the coast and saving the climbing for later. They stopped for what Edelston told her would be the last time. In about 3 hours, they would be there. Phoebe set to reading the last portion of Leonida's narrative, wondering how he had found his way to this part of the world. I traveled through the Slavic lands that had never bowed before the atonement, never accepted the idea that history obliged them to hand over their lands and their women to foreigners. I enjoyed the time, working odd jobs for a while in each city before moving on. But I could not help noticing that the farther north I traveled, the less people gave a thought to the threat. When I asked if they worried about it at all, they pointed out that the Muslims had been stopped at the Danube and were too busy with their new lands in the west to attempt an attack from that direction. Those I spoke to did not fully understand that outside the House of Islam, there is only the House of War. When I came to the Baltic nations, I encountered Turks and Iranians, men from areas devastated by war and willing to work for next to nothing. They had been allowed in not as refugees but as cheap labor. The government said this was only a temporary measure, that they were only to perform tasks that Latvians or Lithuanians would rather not do. But that is how it always begins. When a nation cannot supply its own labor needs, either its women have stopped having children, or its men have become soft and lazy. The cheap labor of foreigners is like an addictive and fatal drug. It weakens a nation, yet assures it there is no price to be paid for weakness. Later, when the nation is in peril of its life, it cannot be roused to the danger. But while the drug postpones the final reckoning, when the reckoning comes, it is swift and terrible. I longed for adventure, so I took ship with the Estonian merchant fleet. We had to sail through the dangerous straits of the Kat al-Get, where Somalian pirates from Sweden lay in wait for the unwary. But those hardy sailors of Tallinn kept their own, and we made it to the ocean. We were headed for America to sell food there, for it was 2070, and the hunger was then in its 4th year. The ports along the Atlantic were unsafe, for there were occasional riots in the cities. As for the smaller towns, where there was no distribution of food, we had heard reports of ships landing only to be seized by force, their crews killed. So we went up the St. Lawrence, on into the great seas that carve a path to the center of this continent. Our destination was the great city of Chicano, for food could always be sold there for a good price. But in Toronto, a Chinese merchant paid us to go instead to Duluth, where his company did business. So we passed into the Northern Sea, but we never reached Duluth. A great storm came up all of a sudden and swept through the Northern Sea. Our huge ship, the Argus, was tossed about like a child's toy, and we lost sight of our sister ship, the Hydrus. I learned then how puny men are, compared to the giant powers of the sea and the storm. I fell overboard and nearly drowned, but that alone allowed me to escape the final sinking of the ship. I washed upon the shore, exhausted, and passed out. No other man from that crew was ever found. I do not know how long I lay there. When I came to, I thought I must have died, for I heard angels calling out. Someone rolled me over, and I coughed and gasped. The voices now screamed and ran away, but one stayed close by me, talking to me gently, holding my head in her lap. I didn't understand a word. I only wanted her to stay with me. As my eyes focused, I saw the most beautiful face I have ever seen. I spoke to her in my native tongue, even though she could not understand. I told her that if I were not dead, I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. Here Phoebe could see that Leonidas had attempted another sketch, except that halfway through, evidently unsatisfied, he had erased it. The erasure was not complete, however, for while the next paragraphs were written over it, she could still perceive the outline of the girl's features, her eyes looking through her beloved's words as through a window. She brushed my hair and wiped the tears from my eyes. Nausicaa, I called her, and I could tell she knew the meaning of that, though no other word I said. Ever after, she insisted I call her that, and so I will again, when we meet on the other side of the veil. In the distance, I saw a lighthouse which, as I would learn, the bears called the White Tower, but long ago was named Crisp Point. That is how I found myself in Bear Garth. Phoebe. She looked up. Edelston was looking past her, off to the west. There's a storm coming. I'm afraid we need get moving so we can get there first. Reluctantly, she left off the remaining pages of the book, and they resumed their hike. The sky was indeed darkening, and the high ridge of the Drakensberg, stretching far off to the east, was shrouded in clouds. They moved at a faster pace now, stopping only once, when Edelston pointed to a nearby tree. It looked ordinary enough, until she noticed a distinct arrow shape at eye level, pointing upward. He whispered something that sounded like, "Tyr," then said, "We're getting close." The rangers made this mark. As they hiked on, she noticed other trees notched with the arrow symbol. Once, she thought she detected movement off to the side, whether a person or an animal she couldn't tell, and simultaneously Edelston made a sound like an owl. But when she looked back from him to the trees, she could see nothing there. They climbed higher now, the northern sea at their backs. Near the top, they were above a fog that was gathering ahead of the storm, and she could no longer see the ground below. At the summit, Phoebe felt the ground flatten out. When she kicked at some of the soil, underneath lay asphalt. Here, nature had reclaimed its own, but the hand of man had eagerly assisted to hide any sign of a human presence. Edelston guided her out onto a rocky ledge. "That," he said, pointing down, "is Lake of the Clouds." She peered down through the mists. "I don't see anything," and then the bank of fog rolled away, and before the next one rolled in, there she saw the lake below. It stretched off to the east perhaps 2 kilometers, hemmed into the south by a line of hills that rose less severely, but just as high as the ridge they were on. Ridgeline. She felt a chill, and the darkening sky left no doubt that a storm was on its way. Halfway down the length of the lake, Edelston pointed to the far shore. Her heart leapt as she made out human figures, the first she had seen in days. Was it only 6 days since they left Many Apples? It felt like a year. The lake. When they reached its other end, they walked out upon a rocky ledge. On their left, to the southeast, she could make out a broad valley that the river meandered through. And there, on the other side, stood a huge fort, circular in shape. "Is that?" "Yes," he said in a quiet, reverential tone. "That is Wolfgarth." The distance and the darkness conspired to prevent her from seeing more than the shape, but even from here, its size was impressive. Beyond it she saw what looked like farm fields, and then the hills closed back in. Athelstan set a faster pace as they continued along the dragon's spine, keeping an eye on the dark clouds above, but Phoebe was just as eager as he was to reach their destination. Her curiosity had reached a fever pitch, and she hoped to catch another glimpse of the Garth, but the trail afforded no further opportunities. Only an hour passed before they began to descend, but it seemed longer than days to Phoebe. They passed a sign that read, Cuyahoga Mine, and then they were in a low break in the ridge line. Turning south, they followed the trail only a short while until they arrived at a clearing about 20 meters across. Athelstan stopped. An owl sound came, 3 hoots in succession. Athelstan turned to her. Just stay here and don't say a word. Everything will be all right. With that, he turned and walked forward several paces, then stopped. Phoebe noticed he was standing in a circle of small rocks. Slowly and deliberately, he took his gun out of his holster and placed it on the ground, then did the same with the knife strapped to his belt. Then he held his arms straight out, palms forward. He spoke loudly, his voice confident. I am Athelstan, son of Leonidas, son of Ymra, scavenger of Wolfgarth. I bring a daughter of Embla. A voice boomed back from the trees, although Phoebe could not locate the speaker. Athelstan, son of Leonidas, welcome. He picked up his weapons and came back to where she stood. We can enter now. We're there. Part 2. The Garth Chapter 4. Sanctuary Blockhouse, Fort Ross. Courtesy of Wikimedia Commons user introvert, CC by SA 2.5. No modification of original. By user. Introvert, own work. CC by SA 2.5. https://commons.wikimedia.org/w/index.php. Current equals 525373. There was, it would seem, somewhere out in the lonesome dark of the outer lands, but at what distance none could ever discover, a second redoubt, William Hope Hodgson. The Nightland 11. Phoebe followed Athelstan as they passed between 2 hills and entered a broad valley several kilometers wide, bordered by forested ridges north and south. Much of the plain that stretched east and west was covered with fields of crops, with the occasional barn or shed. She caught sight of horses, cows, and other animals, along with the occasional dog. Here and there, people were bringing in the animals or working out in the fields, but they were too distant for her to see well. Up ahead, they were approaching a wooden wall, not tall in comparison to the buildings of many apples, but impressively long, curving away hundreds of meters on either side. As they neared, she saw men stationed along its top, evidently standing on some platform on the other side, for the walls had to be at least 4 meters high. At regular intervals along the wall stood taller towers, with more men inside, looking out narrow windows. On the other side of the wall, she could just make out the tops of wooden buildings 2 stories tall, but as they drew near, the wall obscured her vision. She could see the men atop the wall better now. Some of them were actually teenage boys, their hair cut close to the scalp. An older man with a dark beard barked orders, and a gate in the wall up ahead began to creak open. She edged closer to Athelstan, and he took her hand in his. Then they passed through the gate, into a vast area of wonders. They were walking along a well-worn path, and on either side stood wooden buildings, cabins, she remembered, from the textbook pictures of whites stealing land from the Red Indians. The structures looked sturdy, not like the ramshackle houses familiar to her. Out of their open doors gaped children and the occasional mother, observing them with curiosity. A group of children playing in the road ahead stopped when they saw her and Athelstan, then scattered, probably spreading word of the new arrivals. Phoebe had never seen so many white children. In fact, every single person here was white, something Phoebe had never experienced, not even in the seeds. There were no people of color whatsoever, but color, yes, and of the most brilliant variety. She saw red hair, something she had encountered only a few times before. In many apples, it was a disappearing trait due to mixed-race pairings, and those few whites who had red hair dyed it another color in order not to draw attention to themselves and invite assault. But here were entire families with red hair, and blondes, too, not the fake blondes of the red porn movies, but real blonde hair the color of the fields outside. She saw brown hair of all hues, falling onto shoulders or done up in braids, chestnut and auburn and copper verging on red, with darker shades merging into raven black. And the eyes. Not the uniformly dark eyes that dominated the city, but a kaleidoscope of deep blues and grays, browns and hazels, and arresting greens. Phoebe had never beheld so many whites together, and only now did she realize the wondrous variety that simple label belied. There was more diversity here than in all the races that shambled their way through the ghettos of many apples. Here, truly, was a people of color. There were men tanned by days working in the fields, and women with skin like snow. Some had skin that might have once sported on Mediterranean shores, while others had freckled skin that might have once been chilled by the North Sea. There was yet another difference, more subtle and yet profound. It was how these people carried themselves. In the city, where no one trusted each other, whites above all feared the unexpected reprisal, the anger directed at their mere existence. They walked with heads bent down, eyes hastily averted to avoid contact. Here, however, there were no such signs of shame or fear. Off to the right, Phoebe saw a blonde-haired woman carrying a basket of clothes, and she had the same aloof dignity to her face as the one in the painting who was offering roses. This was a woman who simply did not live in the same world as Redporn and all its debasements. The men here walked erect, heads held high, arms moving confidently, eyes not afraid to meet those of anyone they met. It was not the bouncing swagger of the black youth in the city, but a quiet self-confidence. They were altogether a different species from the white men she had known all her life. And the children, dozens, hundreds of them, playing and running about freely, cheerfully unaware that their counterparts in the city feared the walk home even more than the humiliations of the classroom. Their clothes were brightly colored, as were those of the women, the men alone wearing plainer garb better suited to rough work in field or forest. Still hand in hand, Phoebe and Edelston passed cabins put to other uses besides residence. From one came the chink of metal striking metal, and smoke billowed out through its chimney. From another came the sound of laughter and rich music, and through the door she could see what looked like a large hall, with 30 or 40 people inside. As they walked on, she noticed the broad earthen road was gradually curving inward, with smaller lanes branching off. The curve became more pronounced, then turned sharply as they neared another, inner wall, this one unmanned. The gate to this smaller wall stood open, and they passed through to find themselves in a broad earthen road was gradually curving inward, with smaller lanes branching off. The curve became more pronounced, then turned sharply as they neared another, inner wall, this one unmanned. The gate to this smaller wall stood open, and they passed through to find themselves in a broad circle about 100 meters across. At its center loomed a giant tree Phoebe recognized as an oak, its leaves copper red. This circle, evidently the heart of the entire community, was fed by two other lanes, all placed evenly around its perimeter, all curving, she surmised, like the one they had entered upon. 3 ways led here. Spaced evenly between the 3 gates stood 3 halls, so that each faced an entrance on the opposite side, with the tree in the middle. Massive in comparison to the cabins outside, these halls were high-timbered, with steep gables sweeping down to large eaves that hung over each side. At its apex, each roof formed a small V above the larger inverted V of the downward slopes. In front of each hall, a few meters from the door, stood a large stone, its vertical surfaces flat. Edelston was leading her across the circle, around the tree to the hall across from the gate they had entered. When they had reached its steps, he turned and helped her take off her pack, then placed his own on the ground. It's Tuesday, so the men's council will be in session. I need to make my report to them, but first they're going to ask you some questions. He looked at her, and she detected a note of concern in his eyes, although his smile was reassuring. Just be honest with them. Don't worry, he added with an encouraging wink. Everything will be all right. She shivered, thankful for the wind whipping across the plaza because it hid her nervousness. Ring. With this he gave 3 hard raps that echoed inside, then stepped back. After a short while, both doors slowly swung open, revealing the man pushing them open. He was a young man, dark-haired and clean-shaven, with muscled arms and a hard look to his face. On one hip he wore a holstered gun, and on the other, a long knife, a sword, Phoebe suddenly realized, never having seen one except in pictures. As soon as he saw Edelston, he broke into a broad grin, and the 2 men met in a hearty hug. Back so soon, as Leonidas would say, when the nets are full, you head for port. The man motioned for the 2 of them to enter, and they crossed the threshold. When he shut the doors behind them, what little sunlight the clouds had let through was shut out entirely. Their escort guided them through the dark interior, the only illumination being a large fire in the center of the great hall. Along the walls, steel glinted from bladed weapons and other instruments of war, both ancient and modern, either hanging or lined in racks. The fire ahead was flanked on either side by long benches, seating perhaps 20 men in all, but forming 2 distinct groups. Their faces were hard to make out in the flickering light, but she could see that the larger group, on the left, was clad like Edelston, with leather pants, simple shirts, and buckskin jackets. From the belts of a few hung what she took to be the tools distinctive to their trade, various implements of iron and wood. Some were bearded, others clean-shaven like Edelston. The 4 men seated to the right all wore animal furs over their shoulders. The steely eyes of 3 of them peered at her from below wolf heads, while the 4th was distinguished by a snarling head of a bear. As her eyes adjusted to the light, she realized that the side of the fire opposite to her was occupied, as well. On 3 tall chairs that looked rather like wooden thrones sat 3 men much older than those seated on the benches. The one in the middle wore an eye patch, while the other 2, seated just as high, had his same weather-beaten face and gray beard. The rising heat waves from the fire prevented Phoebe from getting a clearer view of them. Their escort, having led them to the fire, withdrew a few paces. Edelston let go of her hand, stepped forward, and spoke. Athelstan, son of Leonidas, son of Emra, returns to the council to make the scavenger's report. I also bring this daughter of Embla to join the Garth, according to the established customs. She is my snow maiden. Phoebe's ears pricked at the words but failed to grasp their meaning. She had no time to speculate, however, for a middle-aged man on the left, wearing tools of iron on his belt, spoke. Your snow maiden she may be, but whether daughter of Embla is for the councils to determine. On the right, the man with bear's jaws atop his head spoke. Edelston has never erred before, which is why the council has granted him the right to bring an outlander directly into the Garth. Let a lady examiner be sent for. Phoebe heard the footsteps of their escort receding, and then light from the open door streamed in briefly before the room was once again lit only by fire. The bearded man on the right, one of the wolves, addressed himself to Phoebe. Outlander, did Edelston tell you anything of what you were likely to encounter here? Did he say anything of the questions, the testing? Phoebe turned nervously to Edelston, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Just be honest, he told her. You. Phoebe. Years of torment lay behind that name. Grandma had told her she should be proud of it, that it was her own mother's name. In her own mother's day, she said, many whites had had names such as that, and no one suffered for it. Later, for the children born in her generation, whites had forsaken these names for new ones that they fashioned themselves, names with no history, tradition, or meaning. In the generation after that, the generation born in the darkening, parents avoided any names that sounded white, for fear of making things even harder for their children. They chose names from the other races. So why couldn't they have given me such a name? Young Phoebe had wondered, as the children singled her out for hazing. But Grandma said that she would understand one day, that names were important. Now at last she began to understand. In giving her an old name, an ancient name, in fact, her mother had refused to completely give in to the retribution. By doing so, she gave her daughter a childhood with more pain, but stubbornness wouldn't let her do otherwise. Phoebe recognized the same mindset in her grandmother, and doubtless her mother, whose name Phoebe bore, had had it, too. And on back to the unknown matriarch whose picture she treasured, the woman dandling Grandma on her knee, confidently facing a future that was already darkening. That combative pride burned in the women of her line, who would not stay down when pushed, whether their men would or not. She thought of Ethelstan, standing beside her, and of his naming. No parents who had buckled before the retribution would have named him thus. Those parents had died on their knees, begging to be forgiven for crimes they had never committed. There was another way. In that instant, Phoebe realized that the testing had already begun. These were things that mattered, that told much in an age in which all names bore significance. Phoebe was my great-grandmother's name. And your grandmother, Alice. Then as Phoebe, daughter of Virginia, daughter of Alice, is how you shall be known, the wolf-clad man said with a gleam in his eye, as if anticipating a successful end to the testing. Aside. The woman's red hair, bound in a long braid that disappeared down her back, gave an otherworldly look to her in the firelight, as if she shared fire's elemental nature. When she took Phoebe's hands in her own, her touch was soft and reassuring. She turned Phoebe's hands over, as if to inspect them, then looked up into her eyes. Firelight played across the woman's face, green eyes catching the flame in a piercing gaze that gave no hints of what she was after, as her eyes roamed over Phoebe's face. Then she ran one hand through Phoebe's long brown hair, letting it fall, strand by strand. Touching Phoebe's neck, she delicately pulled back the top of her shirt enough to see the shoulder. The wolf-clad man spoke. Do you need light? You may take her outside if you wish. No, that won't be necessary, thank you. The woman leaned forward and whispered in Phoebe's ear, so quiet that not even Ethelstan could hear, do you carry a child within you? The question took Phoebe aback, but she managed to whisper, no. I've not, she whispered into the woman's ear, so that no one could read her lips. I've never been with a man. The woman looked into her eyes again, as if searching for something there. Then she smiled, turned back to the fire, and addressed the men. She is a daughter of Embla. I accept her on behalf of the Women's Council. The voice of the wolf-clad man sounded again. I see no need for further questioning. Does any man object to accepting her into the Garth? Silence. Phoebe, daughter of Virginia, daughter of Alice. Phoebe turned from the woman to face the fire and the men seated around it. You may stay in the Garth. We must speak with Ethelstan a while longer, but Lady Brigid will see that you are taken care of in the meantime. She glanced at Ethelstan, and he nodded silently. Turning to the speaker, she said, thank you, made a hasty bow to the fur-clad men on her right, then another to those on the left. But when she turned to the fire, to thank the three ancients on their wooden thrones, she discovered that only the center seat was occupied. Two men had vanished, and from across the fire only the one in the middle looked at her, his single eye gleaming. Had the fire played tricks on her eyes? She recalled one winter in Many Apples, when the dawning sun had appeared as three. Her grandmother had said something about ice crystals in the air. Could fire do the same? Yet why had only one of the men been missing an eye? As she stood there in wonder, the old man accorded her the faintest nod. The woman took her by the hand and led her away from the fire. Phoebe looked back to see Edelston taking his seat with the wild-looking men on the right. It was the first time they had ever been separated. Outside, the light, despite the gathering storm, was enough to dazzle her eyes, but she noticed the sun was nearing the hills to the southwest. Now she could get a better look at her examiner. Lady Brigid, as they had called her, was strikingly beautiful. She looked to be in her 30s, but she could have been older, it was hard to tell. Her beauty was natural, something Phoebe was not used to seeing. She wore a dark green dress with a white belt that made Phoebe feel ashamed of her own shabby clothes. Lady Brigid gave her a comforting smile. All that back there must have been bewildering, but it's over now. Let me take you over to the Women's Council. We can leave your packs here. Edelston will take them back. Back where? Questions now clamored for her attention. Questions she had given little thought to in the forest, when the Garth was just a dream and the ironwood constituted their entire world. Now, it seemed, she had set foot in yet another world, one more confusing and mysterious than the forest. It was like departing Many Apples all over again. The woman set a leisurely pace, heading counterclockwise around the circle, toward another of the three great halls. My husband Connor is good friends with Edelston. Our house is quite near his, in fact. My children will be delighted to have a visitor. How many children do you have? 8, although the oldest one is married and no longer lives at home. 8. Phoebe could not conceal her shock. Rarely, one would hear rumors about a family that had secretly dared to have a second or even a third child. Inevitably someone informed on them, for the reward money was too tempting. But such cases were few. The era had only codified what she had always assumed to be in the nature of her race, a steady dwindling down with each generation. Yet here this woman openly admitted to having 8 children. Lady Brigid smiled. Brigid. It's only men and other people's children who address a married woman that way. Oh, I'm sorry, Brigid, there was something Edelston said back there. He called me, Snow Maiden. What does that mean? Brigid stopped short, her eyes wide. He called you his Snow Maiden. Yes. Brigid beamed at her. Surprise. Only the night before, she had told him she wanted to be his forever, and he felt the same way. But she felt a special delight now in his possessiveness, in his readiness to proclaim it, after a fashion, to the others. She liked to imagine he was marking her as his, so that no one could entertain other hopes. Why else would he have been so quick to declare it? No, I guess it's not a surprise. I'm just not used to your customs, that's all. They do things differently in the Outlands, I know. Don't worry, I will help prepare you. I only half understand what it is he does, as a scavenger. We talked about a lot of things, but... Go on. You saw some of these at the men's council, they were seated on the left. Those on the right, wearing wolf skins, were rangers. They're a special case, because rather than being in the Garth or near the Garth, they roam far to make sure no danger comes too close. One of them wore a bear skin. That was Connor, my husband. He originally came from Bear Garth, as did I. When we were leaving, I thought I saw Edelston sit down with them, but he's not a ranger. It was more question than statement. Correct. Like them, he journeys out, but much further, 100 miles or more. And whereas a ranger roams the woods, a scavenger goes into the cities. There he searches among what the Outlanders consider human trash, to see if he can find any of the remnant, people who belong with us. There used to be more scavengers in the early days, she went on, looking out at the surrounding hills. But it was, and is, very dangerous work, and some never came back. For a long time, Leonidas was the only one we had left. But when Edelston came, we could see something special in him, and he obviously knew the Outlanders' ways. So Leonidas adopted him, and Edelston became his apprentice. By tradition, a scavenger sits with the rangers. What about the men in the center? He insisted. Halls. This one was the same size as the first one, and Phoebe saw that it, too, had a central fire with benches about. But there the similarities ended. The walls here were lined not with weapons but with linens and quilts, rolls of cloth and finished garments. The benches had more occupants, about 36 women. And it was not a single discussion that occupied them, but several conversations in groups of 2 or 3 or 4. Occasionally one group would grow quiet and listen to another discussion or join it. Several of the women, she noticed, were nursing babies, others did work with a needle as they talked. There appeared to be no difference, as there had been in the men's council, between groups on left and right, although Phoebe did notice 3 old women seated on the other side of the fire, in the center. In light of her recent encounter, she couldn't help but ask Brigid about them. "Do you see them, too?" she whispered. "The 3 in the middle." Brigid smiled. "Yes, those are founders." The conversations continued even as the 2 of them stepped closer to the fire, although Phoebe caught several of the women looking at her, including one of the old women. She felt nervous here, but in a way different from how she had felt before the men's council. There, she had been among an alien element, the wild, gruff, and violent world of men. There had been no foothold to support her, no common experience to call upon. Here, on the other hand, she was among peers, for a few of these women were not much older than she, maybe in their late 20s, and the others were not so unlike her own mother and grandmother. She would have liked nothing more than to slip unnoticed into one of the conversations. But the gulf between her and these women, while much narrower than that between her and the men, was all the more noticeable because it stopped just short of being crossable. Although she was now a member of the Garth, she did not yet feel like one. If only Edelston were here, she thought. It was then she realized that Brigid was holding her hand. Phoebe squeezed her hand gently in thanks. Brigid cleared her throat to make an announcement. "Ladies of the council, Edelston has returned with one of the remnant, Phoebe, daughter of Virginia, daughter of Alice. She has passed the examination." She paused just a second, a tight smile betraying her relish in what she was about to say. "Phoebe is Edelston's snow maiden." Raised eyebrows and expressions of surprise rippled through the assemblage. Finally, one woman, her blonde hair arranged in elaborate braids on top of her head, interrupted the murmur. "Phoebe." Brigid guided her over to a seat on the left. A woman brought over a fussy baby to Brigid, who began to nurse her. "This is Fiona, my youngest," she said, looking down into her daughter's contented eyes. "She has red hair like you." "Yes, she does." As Phoebe looked around, it dawned on her that no one was going to question her, that the women were content to let her ease into life in the Garth. Her nervousness began to evaporate, leaving only curiosity. "I think," she said, "I understood some of what happened in the men's council, what you called the examination. But it might help if you explained it to me." Brigid looked up from her baby. "That's all right. You see, no one is allowed into the Garth." Garth, Phoebe repeated to herself, as it sank in that this was the mysterious place Edelston had spoken of. Behalf. It is he who must face any outside threat to the house. Well, the Garth is like a large house for all of us. The men protect us against the dangers outside it, but we ladies must also approve if an outlander wishes to enter. How did you approve? I mean, what were you looking for? For your race, Brigid replied matter-of-factly. It. Council. Father. In that case, too, we could not have allowed you to remain. We women, you see, are the guardians of the race. In all the world, only a white woman can give birth to a white child. But see how few choose to do so, at least in the outlands. If we fall, the race falls. Phoebe recognized the truth in her words. Men could avoid the consequences of sex, but women, try as they might, could not. Ultimately, it was up to the woman to draw the line. Her mother had raised her to be chaste at a time when promiscuity was the norm. Phoebe had known so many women in the seed who needed no encouragement to find a colored husband, even without the inducements of the Red Act. Having a mixed-race child had become a mark of pride. It almost erased a woman's whiteness, and thus her guilt, in the eyes of the retribution. Have you ever rejected anyone? Yes, but not often. A good scavenger will not bring back a questionable person. And we are very remote here, so it is rare for someone to arrive on their own. But every once in a while, the Rangers will encounter someone. The hunger left some pockets of the old population behind. She sighed. 2 years ago, they came across a half-black woman and her 2 mixed-race children. Apparently she had been with a werewolf, and when he died, she came in search of a place she had heard rumors about. When the Rangers found her wandering the woods, 2 other women from the council and I were asked to accompany them into the forest in order to examine her. Her skin was the color of dark sand, and flawless in its own way. You look surprised to hear me say that. But you must understand, we harbor no hatred for other races, only love for our own kind. I suppose the kind thing would be to take in this woman and her children. But kindness can be cruel, as they say. Enough kindnesses, and the last refuges of our folk would be no more. So the Rangers escorted her south, and gave her enough food to last her several days. Brigid looked around at the other women of the council. Her traits. These things disappear. Could it be that all the intangible things that characterize our folk are, like blue eyes, recessive? Phoebe knew all too well how enthusiastically whites imitated other races, the way they talked, the way they acted. Rarely was the imitation successful, but even when it was, the result was all the worse, for it did not spring from something innate. Brigid went on. I certainly don't know history as well as Ethelstan, but I remember him talking about how no empire was ever destroyed merely from without, but from within. Whites in the outlands were overcome only through their own weakness. He told me that in the beginning of the Great Migration to Europe, even before the Retribution, or the Atonement I guess they called it there, white women would line up to kiss the Arab and African men as they arrived by the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands. Many of those same men would end up stealing and raping and murdering, and they would multiply among the Europeans like weeds taking over a garden. And many of those same women would pay with their bodies or their lives. Yes, kindness can even kill. Brigid looked down at her baby. It may seem strict that any outlander must pass the test you had to undergo. And it may seem ruthless that we would have rejected you if your skin were dark, or if you had a colored man's child in your womb. But we are prepared to be ruthless, like a she-wolf protecting her pups. A woman is a warrior, and birth is a battle, as the saying goes. We are the veterans called to the front lines. Thousands of generations stretching back to the beginning depend upon us. If we fail, there is no future. Phoebe knew that Brigid was right. She had grown up in a world that treated whites, at best, as inconvenient residents of the planet, and the sooner they disappeared, the better. If it hadn't been for her family, she would have grown up feeling like complete trash. She shuddered to think of how, had she been raised differently, she might easily have ended up in Retporn, never to have a child, or birthing some man's half-breed offspring. Thousands of years of continuity would have been broken in a single generation. The colored races now have every continent on Earth, Brigid went on. Genocide. The deliberate annihilation of an entire people. There were more ways than force to accomplish that end. Her education had always accused whites of committing it, but how is it that whites were now the only race in danger of disappearing? Brigid was right. Africa still produced all the numberless black tribes. Asia's teeming billions were not going anywhere. The Hispanics crowded one continent and more than half of another. It was only the whites' homelands that had been invaded by waves of refugees and immigrants. They alone had been persuaded that this was only just. And they alone now stood in danger of extinction. There was no place for the race that had bestowed upon the world the highest science, medicine, technology, and art. If, as Brigid put it, it was a war that these women were waging, it was potentially the last battle, a final, heroic stand. Once the race was gone, it would be gone forever, along with all of its unique qualities. Phoebe returned to a phrase that had puzzled her. More than once today I've been referred to as a daughter of Embla. What does that mean? Brigid, busy now burping her daughter, looked over at Phoebe, her eyes traveling down to her chest. Phoebe looked down to find the small crucifix hanging there, so much a part of her that she had forgotten it was there. I see that Edelston has not told you of our ways. Strange, with so many days together. But he may have had his reasons. As for, daughter of Embla, that is something for you to ask him. Our ways are not yours, Phoebe, although you may find elements here of what you believe. Seldom is anything useful thrown away. But unlike some, we do not judge a man or a woman by what they believe, but by their character and their deeds. Just try to be understanding, and be patient. Remember, you are a member of the Garth now. Love around the hearth, frith in the garth, as they say. Seeing Phoebe's confusion, she explained. Frith is not a word that exists in English anymore. It's funny, Edelston said once that if a word doesn't exist, it's because people are no longer thinking about the thing that it signifies. But here in the Garth, we do think about it, so we had to bring back the old word. Frith is when you have peace in a community, and safety and security, but it's more than that. It's the joy of being with your own folk. It means strong families, the closeness of kin and clan. When you have all of that, you have Frith. What I was trying to say is that you shouldn't worry if we don't share your faith. We value Frith so strongly that we will not allow it to become a point of division among us. Just hear Edelston out, even if his explanation sounds strange to you at first. You will find no better teacher on that score. She had now set her baby on her lap, and the little one was sucking on her hand and taking in the sights of the women all around. But there are some things he cannot teach you, and some things he is not fit to. So I will be preparing you for your wedding. Wedding. Phoebe's heart raced. The prospect of becoming Edelston's wife had suddenly moved from the world of daydreams to reality. Hesitate. Phoebe thought of Edelston, of all that they had shared, and all that she wanted to share with him. There were no doubts in her mind. I want to marry him more than anything else. Well, that's a good start. Make sure to remember that down the road, when things are more difficult. Having issued this cryptic warning, she stood up, holding her baby against her shoulder. All produced. Ease. There. Brigid headed in the direction of the men's council, then turned left to take another of the 3 roads that led out through the inner walls. Phoebe walked with her, clutching her pile of clothes. A warm feeling suffused her, despite the chill. In 2 days, she would be married, and they would be happy, and they could have as many children as they wanted, with no guilt, and she would learn to be like this confident, beautiful woman next to her. It was as if she had discovered that every fairy tale, every childhood belief she had been robbed of, was actually true. She felt that the bearers of harsh reality had lied to her, that it was in their interest to do so, but now the mask had slipped, the liar had been revealed, and it was all right to be a child again. As they walked down the curving road, the sunset was fading into twilight. The whiteness of the Garth's residence stood out even more against the gathering dark. It seemed as if every window framed a child's face, and a chubby toddler peered from behind each mother that stood in the doorway, waiting to greet her husband as he returned from the fields. Soon I will be like that, she thought. A horse-drawn cart rolled by, loaded with cut logs. Men sat behind the horses as well as on top of the logs. Brigid, taking one of the smaller lanes that led off the spiraling road, led her into a strictly residential area. Here there were no shops or common halls, only homes, large cabins that varied in shape and appearance. The logs were flat on the outside, with whitish bands in between each one. Most of the homes had high, sloping roofs, from under which second-story windows peered on each gable. A covered porch resting on beams seemed to be the rule, along with a vegetable garden in the back. Doors stood open, and hearth fires lit the interiors. In front of many of the houses, Phoebe noticed fathers chopping firewood while their children, excited to have them back from the day's labor, ran about. The lumberjacks, Brigid explained, would drop off cut logs, but it was up to each man to chop it up for use in the home fire. Lumber had once drawn people to this region, that and mining. Now once again those two occupations flourished, not for profit but for survival. The very name for the central circle of the Garth, the pith, was taken from the lumberjacks. Like the growth rings on a tree, the Garth had grown outward, far beyond the dimensions of its original core. The pith now constituted the central hub of the Garth as well as its last line of defense. Contact. Surely such a world had too many problems to bother with them. She looked at Brigid sidelong as they walked, the white of her face framed by the red hair darkening in the twilight. Something in the tension around her eyes, in the tightness of her lips, suggested to Phoebe that a nerve had been touched, something connected to great suffering but also grim determination. Now was not the time, she decided, to delve deeper. Brigid stopped in front of a cabin where a teenage boy was chopping wood. Phoebe, this is Liam, my second oldest. Liam, this is Phoebe, Edelston's snow maiden. He was not much younger than Phoebe, perhaps 16 or 17, with his mother's red hair, but with blue eyes, not green. He looked at Phoebe with as much indulgence as he could safely get away with in front of his mother, before greeting her with a formality and deference she had never experienced from one his age. With that, he resumed chopping wood. Brigid steered Phoebe further down the lane. He is eager to start the trials, she confided. Drawn. The door, however, stood open, and from around an interior corner came the light from a fire. Edelston was inside, even though they had been together for 7 days now, and apart for only an hour. Suddenly she felt as nervous as the moment she had awoken to find him in her apartment. Only the night before, they had shared a sleeping bag under the stars, yet the four walls she was about to enter promised an even stronger intimacy. In the forest, they had teetered on the edge of wild abandon, but now the same actions would have social sanction, a space marked out by the community as their own. The mutual ownership that Phoebe longed for now had a place. Phoebe looked now to Brigid, realizing that she must seem like a child seeking reassurance, and partly feeling it to be so. Brigid smiled knowingly. The day after tomorrow, Phoebe, 2 ceremonies will be performed. One will make you Edelston's wife. The other will formally invest you with authority as the woman of this house. But this house, and the man inside it, are as much yours now as they will ever be. Remember that. Now I will leave you for a moment to see how my daughters have done with dinner. We'll bring some over for you. Thank you for everything, Brigid. Brigid placed her hand on Phoebe's, squeezed it gently, then turned and headed for her own home. Had there been sunlight, Phoebe would have paused a while to take in the appearance of her house, but there would be time enough for that. Days, weeks, whole seasons to notice the details of home and setting. So, carrying her clothes, she walked to the open door and stepped across the threshold. There were 3 ways leading from this small entry. To her right, a shut door. Straight ahead, a wooden staircase that turned quickly to the left as it went upstairs. And on her left, a door that opened on a lit room. She stepped through it and found herself in a room that stretched back as far as the cabin itself, with curtained windows. To the right, Edelston was kneeling by the fire, which was framed by an immense stone fireplace that was as long as he was tall. He looked up at her, and she could see the firelight dance in his eyes the way it had those nights in the forest. "Hi, Edelston." Several heartbeats crowded into the short moment before he held her in his arms, and suddenly another hour's absence in this lifetime seemed intolerable. They kissed, not in passionate haste, but leisurely, secure in the knowledge that what they wanted was here and would not leave. Edelston took her things. Purpose. In the middle, directly facing the fireplace, was a rocking chair, and beside it, a bookcase piled with more books than Phoebe could imagine. Everywhere she looked, on the bookcase, the chairs, the wheel, even the ceiling beams, a riot of carpentry was on display. This place was made by a people that loved to work in wood. Edelston was kneeling down by the fire once more, and when he rose he was carrying a candle in a lantern. "Let me show you the rest." He led her to the back, where on the other side of the fireplace the wall admitted a door. Through this, Edelston's light shone on a smaller room, but large enough to have ample space for a large bed and an imposing wardrobe, its doors shut. Next to the bed was the most curious object Phoebe had yet seen, a cradle. She looked up at him, eyes questioning. "This was Leonidas' house," Edelston explained. "It passed to me after he died. That cradle was to be for his child, but Nausicaa died in the fall of Bear Garth, and that child was never born." Phoebe recognized the name from Leonidas' account, which she had yet to finish. The cradle bore mute testimony to the loving anticipation of new life. Its intricate carvings and designs culminated in a beautiful scene painted on the headboard, of a baby asleep on a boat pulled by 2 swans. His head rested on a shock of wheat, and at his feet lay an unexpected assortment of jewelry, weapons, and tools, including a wheel like the one in the main room. As she beheld the baby, sweetly rocked to sleep by the waves, the knowledge came to her, inexplicably and all at once. Leonidas built this, but Nausicaa painted it. She had a clear image in her mind of a young woman, her belly already swelling, painting the cradle with a brush formed out of her own long hair. She described this to Edelston, her tone more comment than question. He looked at her with the same awe that her encounter with the lady in the forest had carved across his face. But rather than ask how she knew this, he took her by the hand. "Yes, Phoebe, he made this with his own hands, and she painted it with her hair. It deserves to have a child in it." Words tumbled from her lips without thought or effort, not one but many. He took her in his arms and kissed her with such passion that only his strength kept her from falling back, limp and overcome, upon the floor. Slowly he eased her back up, and a string of softer kisses passed between them. Budapest. Above it was a knife, not curved like Edelston's but straight, almost like a butcher knife. Strange letters were carved in wood above these 2 instruments of death. Noticing her gaze, Edelston translated. "It means, come and take them." 12 Those were the words spoken by his namesake, who was a great warrior and king. He led 300 men to defend a narrow pass against an enemy more numerous than sand on the beach. When the enemy king, with all the armies of Asia and Africa at his back, demanded that Leonida's men hand over their weapons. This was his reply. He led her across the entryway to the other door. Passing through it, she saw by the light of his lantern what had to be a kitchen, larger than the bedroom that lay on the other side of the wall, but smaller than the living room. This room, too, was dominated by a fireplace, even bigger on this side of the wall than on the other, almost large enough to walk inside, in fact. Clearly, this is where cooking was done, but Phoebe, accustomed to food being heated in a microwave, could only guess at the relationship between its components. At waist height, there was a large recessed hole with a flat interior, with another, smaller hole beneath that. A heavy-looking, blackened pot hung from a hook mounted on a metal beam that jutted out from the side, and various poles and tools lay all about. Elsewhere, two cabinets faced each other across the room, and up against the wall shared with the bedroom stood a large kitchen table. A couple of chairs flanked it, but the variety of implements on top suggested that this was a place more for making food than eating it. "I am afraid this room has not seen much activity," Eggleston admitted sheepishly. "I'm gone for long stretches, and when I'm back here, Connor and Brigid often have me over. But sometimes they come over here, and Brigid keeps an eye on the place when I am gone." Phoebe could see that Eggleston, for all his book learning and worldly experience, probably knew little more about this aspect of life in the Garth than she did. "This will be my space," she realized with mounting happiness, "and all these my things." And then it struck her that all the rooms in this house were properly hers, and that, in a sense, all men were interlopers in their own homes. Reflecting on their time in the woods, she realized that the forest and the wild spaces were suitable to men's nature. Centuries of living in the cities could not change that. To be sure, she had enjoyed their time in the ironwood because she was with Eggleston, but only now did she realize what she had missed, what the modern world had deprived her of, the opportunity to provide a family with all that makes life worth living. Merely surviving is not the same thing as living, she thought. In an odd way, the modern world had ended up returning the race to that primal state. The constant stresses and interruptions gave one the sense of being hunted and stalked, undoing any of the convenience that automation and technology supposedly brought. Civilization, that precarious state between masculine periods of savagery and the social dissolution now rending the outlands, was inherently rooted in feminine nurturing. And yet it could not exist for one breath without the protection and order that men, good men, provided. She recognized the inherent truth in Brigid's words about the nature of the Garth. Turning about, Phoebe noticed two other items. One was a sink, and when she turned the tap, it produced cold running water. The other feature, a door, she had at first taken for another exit, until Eggleston opened it to reveal a closet, placed on the outside of the house, that contained a toilet. It was wooden, with a metal pipe running up to a wooden box above head level, from which a chain hung. The presence of these two fixtures meant there was a supply of running water as well as a system for disposing of waste. This came as a shock to Phoebe, since everything she had seen so far suggested a way of life hundreds of years old. Eggleston laughed at her surprise. Pointing toward the toilet and its pipes, he said, "There's no technology here that wasn't around hundreds of years ago, or could have been. The wooden pipes we have underground are the same kind that were around centuries BTR. The Seabees, our engineer tradesmen, built that. The Garth didn't start out this way, at least not entirely, but as the retribution progressed, the founders had to find ways to do without outside technology. They faced a situation very similar to our ancestors, and they came up with very similar solutions. Much of what we think of as invention is actually rediscovering what we've forgotten." After showing her how to operate the toilet, a welcome addition, she conceded, to her life after 7 days in the woods, he announced that Brigid's daughters were going to bring food for their dinner. After the men's council, Connor had invited the two of them over, but Ethelstan had politely declined, on the grounds that spending her first meal with nearly a dozen new people might be overwhelming for Phoebe. Or that she was grateful. While she was certainly curious to see Brigid's family, she felt that tonight was for the two of them to get accustomed to each other in this new place. I should probably head over, he added, to see if they need any help bringing it over. Will you be all right here for a few minutes? She answered with a kiss. When he had departed, she took advantage of his absence to use the new amenities. After washing her hands, she turned around and noticed something sitting atop the wooden mantel above the kitchen's stone fireplace. Looking closer, she saw that it was a small statue of a woman, carved out of wood. The woman wore a dress, belted like Brigid's, with strings crisscrossed over her chest. She was sitting, and at her feet were two farm animals, one like a small horse but with a shaggy coat, the other a goose like those they had seen flying south across the ironwood. At the woman's right side lay a basket, and in the basket lay a baby, fast asleep. In the woman's left hand, she held a pole with what looked like hair, or maybe string, wrapped around it, and in her right, she held a much smaller version of the same thing, no bigger than her hand. The broad sleeves of her dress hung down as she extended this hand over the baby, appearing to bless it with this wound-around stick. Some ancient memory stirred within Phoebe, something about a baby, and 3 fairies, and 3 blessings for the fate of the child. She felt that there was something otherworldly about this woman and the pose she struck, but intuited that it was not a depiction of the woman she had met in the forest. No, this woman was different somehow. She looked like Brigid more than anything. Phoebe walked back through the door, heading for the main room, when she noticed the staircase to her right. She climbed it now, to find herself in a long room with sloping roof, its outer, shorter wall meeting the slope about a meter off the floor. A wide chimney rose against the center of the tall wall on the other side, but otherwise the room was stark and empty. To the other side of the staircase, right above the entryway downstairs, was a door. Through it, she found the mirror image of the first room, as well as the only clue to what purpose these rooms were to have served: a single bed lying a lonely distance away on the far wall. These rooms could have held many beds, she realized. And there were 2 rooms, one for boys, one for girls. She thought back to the cradle. How many children might Nausicaa have brought into the world, and rocked in that cradle, and tucked into bed up here? How many lives might have been? Where were those lives? She wondered. She went down the stairs and into the main room, where Ethelstan had placed her things next to the bookcase. The books on the shelves were like a living presence. Like people, they had been rescued by Ethelstan. What had Brigid called them? The Remnant. Walking over, her eyes lit on some of the titles of these tattered and well-worn volumes. They were all unfamiliar to her, and she didn't even know whether she was reading names or just foreign words. Herodotus, Xenophon, Bede, Edda, Saga. Several volumes were numbered and bore the word, Foxfire. One book had a bit of red sticking out, a ribbon. The cover read Tacitus, Germania. She opened it, and the ribbon fell across the page, like a tongue or a line of blood, marking these words. Indeed, they believe something even holy and prophetic resides in women, and they do not scorn to seek their counsel or disregard their replies. 13, she thought back to the men's council, and the one-eyed man who had nodded at her. Leonidas had one eye, Brigid had said. Suddenly she remembered the scavenger's book, which she had yet to finish. Opening her pack, she fished out the leather volume and found where she had left off. When the shipwrecked Leonidas had just been rescued. They took me in, and a few months later, Nausicaa and I were wed. We had a house, and I would go out with the fishermen on the northern sea. Life was more beautiful than I could ever have imagined. You may think it strange that I pass over the subject of our elder kin, but to me, learning of them was as much a homecoming as the white arms of Nausicaa, and in truth, one came with the other. The expression, elder kin, was curious, and though Phoebe continued on, the words kept sounding in her mind, tantalizing her with her inability to decipher them. I thought I had reached a place of final refuge beyond the reach of any threat. But there is no such place. They will never leave us alone, never leave us content. For the world they have created is a miserable place, and they cannot bear the thought that somewhere people are happy and free, beyond their grasp. Scarcely 2 years did we have together, when the shadow fell. I was away at Jackal Garth, for the catch we had was more than we needed, and the boars gladly traded for our fish. Then word came that Bear Garth had fallen. I was there, Edelston, when the rider came. I saw him with my own eyes, as they say, and I rode with the boars. I did not notice when they lost sight of him. All my thoughts were on Nausicaa, and the child she carried within her. We rode those horses hard, and on the afternoon of the third day we arrived. As we neared the Garth, we saw the bodies of those who had tried to flee. We did not stop but emerged from the forest and rode straight through the gates. After the battle for Bucharest I had thought never to see such slaughter again. The bears lay all about, the dead and nearly dead, children in their mothers' arms. Then the boars began their work of vengeance, but I rode through, to our home, hoping to find my Nausicaa, yet hoping somehow not to find her. But there, up ahead, by our door she lay. What they had done to her, she who carried our unborn child, does not bear repeating. I could see that with her last ounce of strength she had taken her own life. Then I set to work, my son, with fire and sword. If I had had my way, not even one man would live to bear that message to the trolls. But against the events of that day, and the burial of the dead, I seal my lips. By now you have seen the mound, and the bear. I came to Wolfgarth then, a dead man among the living, one who should have died defending his wife and child. I came to realize that I was born to war and could not leave it, no matter how far I tried to flee. The wolves put me in charge of the Garth's defenses. It was I who gave it the layout you see now. That is when the trials began, and the rangers, but I did not head the rangers. I chose to roam even farther afield. It is not the rangers who are the warning of an attack, you see, but the scavenger, who can sense the slightest twitch upon the thread. He roams the cities, crosses the highways, hears the whistle in the distance, the rumors in the street, the cracking of heads in the alley. If only we had had a warning then. I am not long now, my son. Already I think I hear Nausicaa whispering my name. Or maybe it is the flutter of wings come to take me. I am dying of my wounds, the infection in the blood is seeping through the body. But I did not want to die in the city, among the outlanders. I wanted to be here, among my own people, so I risked the journey. I have heard some men say that scavenging invites retaliation from the outlanders. They are wrong. Our very existence is an insult to the outlanders. Their hatred is all the justification they require to attack us. Nausicaa never did any outlander ill, nor did any of the bears, and yet it all ended in fire. Here the ink gave way to thick, unkempt letters written in dark brown, with here and there a scorch mark. Examining it closely, Phoebe realized that fire had revealed the words that followed. Leonidas had written this portion in something invisible to the eye, until he'd revealed it to his son, prompted by the last word. The final words spilled across the last pages of the book, breaking up the sentences like bursts of gunfire. They brought me milk, not knowing that I could write with it, as I did when a boy. Take this book, Edelston, and follow the path of my last entry, into the city with its darkness, there to find a woman and her infant child. The father was slain in an eye blink, and I was left for dead, while mother and daughter were taken by a man with deep eyes. Bring them back, and your apprenticeship is done. Then let the wolves decide as they may, I will be with you. They do not see what I see in you, for I have walked with death across this wide world and in you I see his disciple. Or should I say her disciple? The lady. Flutter, flutter. Madarka, Madarka, 14 Sisaxago Madark. The writing broke off. The bottom of the K, a dark trail running off the last page. Reaching the end, Phoebe flipped back through the pages of his narrative to the beginning, where he spoke to his son as one who was at the trials, just as Brigid had said her son would soon be. Then she flipped back further still, and there, stretched across several pages, drawn in meticulous detail, was the path through the ironwood that they had taken. Everything was there. The Drakensberg, the Black River with its falls, Copper Peak, the Iron Shield, the highway crossings, Solon Springs, even a drawing of the mechanic's shop and the car. She turned back another page, her eyes following the road, until it came to a place she knew all too well, Many Apples. Leonidas had kept a diligent record of his whereabouts in the city, depicted on a large map that spilled across several pages. She saw the South Seat and streets whose names she knew. The last details on this page, the instructions for Ethelston, were punctuated by blood spots and The instructions for Ethelston were punctuated by blood spots and red finger smudges. Here the old Hungarian, a world away from Lake Balaton, had finally suffered the blow that would kill him. She lowered the book and looked into the fire, trying to piece together the mystery. A boy Liam's age, perhaps 17, Ethelston had secretly left the Garth on a journey across 3 states, to try and complete the mission that killed his adoptive father. What had happened on the trek? It was hard to avoid the realization that she didn't really know Ethelston. The more she learned, the deeper his mystery. Part of her wanted to reach back to that lonely boy, 2 years younger than she was now, and hold him as he slept beneath the stars, all alone, with Leonidas dead far behind him. But there was another part of her who feared the man in the boy, come too soon, too strong. What had the tough old veteran said? Her lowered. For a moment, all she heard was the groan of floorboards above in rooms that had no children, and the gentle creak of an empty cradle rocking. A knock at the door almost made her heart stop. Ethelston had returned. Chapter 5. Revelation by the Fire. John William Godward, The Delphic Oracle. Public domain. Soon they were seated in the great room, eating out of bowls from the kitchen cupboard, watching the fire. The Irish stew, as he called it, proved to be the most delicious food she had ever had. The food on their journey had been appetizing enough, but after a lifetime of eating processed food, it was amazing what joy could be had from fresh potatoes, carrots, meat, and a few herbs. Nice.